The winter of 1315 killed more people than the Black Death would in some regions. Yet most of us have never heard its story. While history classes dwell on plagues and wars, they skip over the decades when winter itself became the enemy, when the sky turned grey for years at a time, and when entire villages vanished beneath snow that refused to melt. This isn't about a single harsh season. This is about what happened when Earth's climate broke, and an entire civilization had to figure out how to survive. Picture waking up one morning in late spring to find frost covering your fields. Then it happens again the next year, and the year after that. The growing season shrinks by weeks, then months. Your harvest fails, your neighbor's harvest fails, everyone's harvest fails, and suddenly the social order that's held for centuries starts to crack like ice under pressure. That's exactly what happened across Europe starting in the early 1300s. Though people at the time couldn't have known they were entering what we now call the Little Ice Age. They just knew something had gone terribly wrong with the world. The first signs appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly. Monks keeping weather records in monastery scriptoriums noticed their inkwells freezing more often. Alpine villages reported glaciers creeping downward, swallowing pastures that had fed sheep for generations. The Baltic Sea froze solid in 1303, something that hadn't happened in living memory. Wolves, driven mad by hunger, attacked villages in broad daylight. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a planetary fever breaking in reverse. But here's what made this catastrophe different from a simple cold snap. It didn't end. Medieval people were accustomed to harsh winters. They'd developed systems over centuries to handle seasonal cold, stockpiling grain, preserving meat, preparing homes with whatever insulation they could manage. Those systems assumed a certain rhythm to nature, a predictable cycle they could plan around. The Little Ice Age shattered that assumption. Consider the mechanics of medieval survival for a moment. Without modern heating, refrigeration, or global supply chains, communities lived or died by their ability to grow enough food during summer to last through winter. The calculation was brutal in its simplicity. If your harvest produced X amount of grain, and your family needed Y to survive until next harvest, you'd better hope X exceeded Y, with room for spoilage, pests, and emergencies. For centuries, this math worked. Barely, but it worked. Then the temperature dropped an average of just 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees. Doesn't sound like much, does it? You adjust your thermostat by more than that without thinking. But those 2 degrees translated into growing seasons, cut by 3 to 4 weeks. Spring came late, autumn arrived early, and summer barely showed up at all. That delicate equation between harvest and survival, it fell apart completely. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 emerged from this climatic shift like a monster from the depths. It started with rain, not the gentle showers that nourish crops, but relentless, violent storms that began in spring 1315 and continued through autumn. Fields turned to mud. Seeds rotted in the ground. What little grain managed to grow molded before it could be harvested. The rain fell so constantly that salt production from seawater became impossible, which meant no way to preserve what little meat people had. Everything was falling apart at once. You're probably thinking this was just a temporary crisis, that things must have recovered quickly once the rain stopped. They didn't. This famine lasted 7 years. 7 years of hunger so severe that contemporary chronicles describe things we can barely comprehend. Parents abandoning children they couldn't feed. Prisoners in jails resorting to cannibalism. Disease spreading through populations weakened by malnutrition. The dead lying unburied because survivors lacked the strength to dig graves in the frozen earth. But what I discovered digging through medieval records isn't just the horror of what happened. It's how completely this crisis was misunderstood by the people experiencing it. Medieval Europeans had a framework for understanding disaster, and it was entirely religious. When crops failed, it meant God was angry. When disease spread, it was divine punishment for sin. This worldview actually made sense, given their limited scientific knowledge. They couldn't see climate patterns or understand atmospheric changes. They couldn't know that volcanic eruptions in distant parts of the world were throwing ash into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the planet. All they knew was that their world had turned hostile, and they needed an explanation that fit their understanding of how reality worked. So they looked for scapegoats. Jews were massacred in waves across Europe, accused of poisoning wells or cursing harvests. Lepers were burned alive. Women who knew herbalism were condemned as witches controlling the weather. The hunger and cold didn't just kill people directly, it twisted societies into turning on themselves, each community looking for someone to blame for the suffering that surrounded them. Meanwhile, those who kept written records tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. A monk in Salzburg wrote that the sun had lost its power to warm. A chronicler in France described how nobles were reduced to eating cats and dogs, while peasants boiled leather boots to extract whatever nutrition they could from the hide. An English record from 1316 noted that grain prices had increased by 800% compared to normal years. 800%. Imagine going to buy bread and finding it costs 9 times what it did last year, while your income hasn't changed and your savings are already gone. The infrastructure of medieval life simply couldn't handle this level of sustained crisis. Monasteries that normally provided charity to the poor ran out of supplies. Trade networks broke down as merchants had nothing to trade and no safe roads to travel, even if they did. Kings and nobles hoarded what resources they had, sometimes by force, creating more resentment and instability. The social contract that held medieval society together, the idea that lords protected peasants in exchange for their labor and loyalty, revealed itself as hollow when protection became impossible and loyalty couldn't fill empty stomachs. Yet here's what strikes me most about this period. Humanity's response wasn't just despair and violence. Some communities found remarkable ways to adapt. Villages in the Alps developed new agricultural techniques, switching from grain to hardier crops that could tolerate shorter growing seasons. Coastal communities increased fishing efforts, developing better preservation methods for seafood. Some regions began systematic forest management, recognizing that fuel for heating was becoming as critical as food for eating. The city of Bruges offers a fascinating case study. Located in modern-day Belgium, Bruges was one of medieval Europe's most prosperous trading centers. When the Great Famine hit, the city's merchants and guild leaders organized something unprecedented, a systematic rationing program combined with price controls on essential goods. They set up communal kitchens to feed the poorest residents. They banned the brewing of beer because it used grain that could feed people instead. These measures didn't eliminate suffering, but they prevented the complete social collapse seen in regions without such organized responses. This coordination required something medieval societies weren't known for: trusting institutions over individual survival instincts. In times of plenty, it's easy to think about the common good. When your children are starving, that calculation changes dramatically. The fact that some communities managed to maintain social cooperation through years of famine tells us something important about human nature that often gets lost in the grimmer historical narratives. But Bruges was an exception. Most of Europe lacked the administrative sophistication, the surplus wealth, or frankly, the social trust to organize such responses. Rural villages, which made up the vast majority of Europe's population, were on their own. And for them, the Little Ice Age wasn't just about cold and hunger. It was about watching everything they'd known about how the world worked prove insufficient. Think about the psychological impact for a moment. Your grandparents told you stories about hard winters. Your parents taught you the skills to survive them. You've lived through cold seasons yourself and made it through. Then suddenly, none of that knowledge works anymore. The weather patterns you've relied on your entire life become unpredictable. The storage techniques that preserved food for generations now fail because the dampness is too severe. The crops that always grew in your fields refuse to sprout no matter what you try. This wasn't just physical survival at stake. It was the collapse of inherited wisdom, the realization that the past couldn't guide the future anymore. For a medieval person whose entire identity was wrapped up in tradition and continuity with ancestors, this psychological break was as devastating as the physical privation. And remember, we're still just talking about the opening decades of the Little Ice Age. This climate disruption would continue, with varying intensity, for roughly 500 years. Generations would be born, live, and die, never knowing the warmer, more stable climate their distant ancestors had enjoyed. The world of the High Middle Ages, with its population growth, cathedral building, and relative prosperity, was over. Something harder, darker, and more uncertain had taken its place. The winter of 1322 finally brought the Great Famine to an end. Not because conditions improved dramatically, but because there were simply fewer people left to feed. Historians estimate that somewhere between 10% and 25% of Northern Europe's population died during those 7 years. Entire villages were abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness. The demographic recovery would take decades, and in some regions, it never really happened at all before the next catastrophe hit. Because here's the thing about the Little Ice Age: the Great Famine was just the beginning. It was the opening act, the first crisis that revealed how vulnerable medieval civilization was to sustained climate change. What came next would test that vulnerability in ways that made the famine look almost manageable by comparison. The decades following 1322 saw a brief respite. Temperatures stabilized somewhat, harvests improved, and people began to believe the worst was over. They rebuilt their lives, repopulated abandoned villages, and tried to forget the horror of those 7 years. But the climate hadn't finished with them, not even close. In the 1340s, the cold intensified again. Alpine glaciers, which had paused their advance, resumed their creeping expansion. Growing seasons shortened once more. Harvest yields declined. And then, in 1347, ships arrived in European ports, carrying something far deadlier than cold weather: Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. The Black Death had arrived, and it was about to kill roughly half of Europe's population. Now, you might think the plague and the Little Ice Age were separate disasters that just happened to occur around the same time, but modern research suggests they were intimately connected. The climate disruption created the conditions that allowed the plague to spread so devastatingly. Malnutrition from repeated harvest failures had weakened immune systems across entire populations. The social chaos and population movements triggered by climate crisis created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The cold weather itself may have altered the behavior of rats and fleas, the vectors that carried plague between humans. In other words, the Little Ice Age didn't just make people cold and hungry, it restructured medieval society in ways that made the plague catastrophe possible. Without understanding the climate context, you can't fully grasp why the Black Death was so deadly, or why it spread so efficiently through populations that had survived previous disease outbreaks. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we explore how climate and plague intertwined, we need to understand what was happening to the physical world itself during these decades of cold. How did villagers adapt to winters that lasted months longer than they used to? What did daily life look like when the temperature dropped and stayed down? How did people heat their homes, feed their families, and maintain any semblance of normal existence when normal had become impossible? The answers reveal a level of resilience and innovation that challenges our modern assumptions about medieval people. They weren't passive victims waiting for disaster to claim them. They fought back against the cold with every tool and technique they could devise. Some of those strategies worked brilliantly, others failed catastrophically, and a few had consequences nobody could have predicted, consequences that would reshape European civilization in profound and lasting ways. Imagine standing in a medieval village square in winter 1325. The snow reaches past your knees, but that's not unusual anymore. What's unusual is that it's late April, a time when spring planting should be well underway. Instead, the ground remains frozen solid. Villagers gather anxiously, debating whether to use their remaining seed grain for planting or eating. If they plant and another late freeze kills the seedlings, everyone starves. If they eat the seeds, there's no chance of harvest at all. These were the impossible choices that defined daily existence during the Little Ice Age's worst decades. The cold changed everything about how people lived. Not just farming, but every single aspect of medieval life had to adapt or fail. Let's start with something you probably didn't learn in history class. Medieval people burned their furniture to stay alive. Not occasionally, systematically. By the 1330s, archaeological evidence shows that households across northern Europe were dismantling benches, tables, even structural beams from their own homes to feed fires that barely kept temperatures above freezing. The wood smoke that once drifted lazily from chimneys now poured out in thick, desperate columns, visible for miles across frozen landscapes. Housing itself became a problem nobody had anticipated. Medieval buildings weren't designed for the cold that was now routine. Traditional construction methods that had worked perfectly well for centuries suddenly proved inadequate when winter temperatures dropped and stayed down for months. The wattle and daub walls that kept out summer rain did almost nothing against wind that seemed to blow straight through them. Thatched roofs that had provided adequate insulation for centuries now leaked heat like sieves. Some communities innovated brilliantly. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, villagers developed new construction techniques that would influence architecture for centuries. They discovered that packing walls with moss, straw, even animal hair created insulation that made homes genuinely warmer. The half-timbered construction style we associate with medieval charm in tourist towns today, that was actually a climate adaptation, a way to create thicker walls with better insulation using less wood than traditional methods required. But innovation required resources, and resources were exactly what most villages lacked. You couldn't redesign your house when you were burning its components for warmth. The choice between structural integrity and immediate survival wasn't really a choice at all. So homes deteriorated, even as their inhabitants struggled to stay warm inside them. The psychological impact of endless cold is something we rarely consider. Modern humans experience winter as an inconvenience, maybe a few months of discomfort before spring arrives on schedule. Medieval villagers in the 1330s had no such certainty. They'd watched seasons become unreliable, watched spring arrive later and later each year, watched summer shrink to a few brief months of merely cool weather rather than genuine warmth. What does that do to a community's collective psyche? Contemporary chronicles describe something we might recognize as widespread depression. Not the medieval kind of melancholy that monks worried about, but genuine psychological crisis spreading through populations that saw no end to the cold. Priests reported that attendance at Mass declined even as people prayed more desperately. The contradiction makes sense when you realize that walking to church in brutal cold required energy people literally didn't have. Malnutrition and hypothermia don't encourage religious attendance, no matter how devout the believer. Food preservation became simultaneously more important and more difficult. In theory, cold weather should help preserve food. In practice, the moisture that accompanied the Little Ice Age created perfect conditions for mold and rot. Grain stores that should have lasted through winter became contaminated within weeks. The traditional storage methods that had worked reliably for generations suddenly failed when humidity level changed and temperatures fluctuated unpredictably. Villages experimented with solutions. Some tried storing grain in sealed containers. Others attempted to dry food more thoroughly before storage. A few communities built specialized storage facilities designed to maintain consistent temperature and humidity. Most of these experiments failed. The ones that succeeded often required resources that villages couldn't spare. You can't build specialized storage when you're burning your existing buildings for heat. Water presented its own crisis. Rivers and streams that had flowed reliably for centuries now froze solid for months at a time. Wells that had never run dry suddenly stopped producing when water tables dropped and underground sources froze. Villagers had to melt snow for water, a process that consumed enormous amounts of fuel and produced water that was often contaminated by whatever the snow had fallen through. The hygiene implications were catastrophic. Medieval people weren't as dirty as popular stereotypes suggest, but they did require water for basic sanitation. When water became scarce and expensive to produce, cleanliness became a luxury that many couldn't afford. Skin conditions proliferated. Lice and fleas thrived in unwashed clothing and bedding. The population was becoming not just cold and hungry, but increasingly filthy in ways that would have profound implications when plague arrived. Clothing evolved rapidly during these decades. The flowing robes and loose garments we see in earlier medieval art give way to tighter, more layered clothing designed to trap heat. The fashion wasn't aesthetic, it was survival. Multiple layers of wool, linen, even leather became standard. The wealthy added fur linings. The poor wore whatever they could acquire, patch upon patch, creating garments that were more repair than original fabric. But even layered clothing couldn't fully protect against cold that seemed to penetrate everything. Frostbite became common, even among people who never ventured far from their homes. Chilblains, those painful inflammations caused by repeated exposure to cold, affected so many people that medical texts from the period devote substantial attention to treatments. Most treatments were useless, but the extensive documentation tells us how widespread the problem was. Children suffered particularly badly. Growing bodies require more calories, more warmth, more resources than adults. They got less. Infant mortality, already high in medieval Europe, climbed steeply during the worst years of cold. Children who survived often showed signs of malnutrition that marked them for life. Skeletal remains from this period show arrested growth lines, literal markers in bone where development paused during times of extreme hardship. The social fabric began to fray in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Villages that had maintained communal solidarity for centuries started to fracture. Theft increased dramatically, particularly theft of firewood and food. Traditional hospitality, the medieval expectation that you would share with neighbors in need, broke down when everyone was in need and nobody had surplus to share. Manor courts, the local institutions that handled disputes and maintained order, found themselves overwhelmed with cases. Accusations of theft, assault, property damage filled court rolls. Reading these documents today is heartbreaking. You see desperate people turning on each other, communities destroying themselves from within because the external pressure was simply too great. Some villages implemented harsh new rules to prevent social collapse. Curfews restricted movement after dark. Watches were established to guard woodpiles and granaries. Punishments for theft became more severe, not because authorities were cruel, but because they were terrified. They could see their communities disintegrating and tried to hold things together through force when cooperation failed. Yet here's what's remarkable. Many communities survived. Not just physically survived, but maintained enough social cohesion to function as communities rather than collections of desperate individuals. How they managed this tells us something profound about medieval society that contradicts our usual assumptions about those times. The key was flexibility. Villages that survived were those willing to abandon tradition when tradition stopped working. They adapted field systems, changed cultivation patterns, modified social hierarchies, reimagined communal obligations. The medieval world we think of as rigid and hidebound was actually capable of remarkable adaptation when survival demanded it. Consider the three-field system, the agricultural arrangement that had dominated European farming for centuries. It worked beautifully in normal climate conditions. During the Little Ice Age, it failed catastrophically. Villages that clung to traditional methods starved. Villages that experimented survived. Some switched to two-field systems that left more land fallow, building soil fertility to compensate for shorter growing seasons. Others abandoned field systems entirely, creating small, intensively cultivated plots closer to villages where they could be protected and tended more carefully. A few pioneered completely new crops, introducing hardy varieties that could survive in conditions that killed traditional grains. The successful adaptations often came from unexpected sources, not from lords or clergy or educated elites, but from ordinary peasants who understood their land intimately and were willing to try anything that might work. Medieval agricultural innovation during this period represents one of history's great examples of bottom-up problem-solving under extreme pressure. But innovation only got you so far. Some changes were beyond human control or adaptation. The advancing glaciers didn't care how clever your farming techniques were. Villages in alpine regions found themselves literally pushed off their land as ice advanced year by year. High-altitude communities that had existed for centuries were abandoned as glaciers reclaimed territory that humans had occupied during warmer times. The population displacement this caused created ripple effects throughout Europe. Refugees from abandoned villages had to go somewhere. They moved to lower altitudes, swelling populations in communities that were already struggling with their own climate challenges. Competition for resources intensified. Tensions increased. The social instability that would eventually contribute to plague's devastating spread was building, one displaced family at a time. Wine production collapsed across northern Europe. Not declined, collapsed. Vineyards that had produced decent wine in England, Germany, Poland simply couldn't ripen grapes anymore. The economic impact was substantial, but the psychological impact may have been greater. Wine wasn't just a beverage, it was a marker of civilization, a sign that you lived in a place where the good life was possible. Its disappearance sent a message nobody wanted to hear. This land was no longer suitable for human flourishing. The Baltic Sea froze solid in 1323. Not just the coastal areas, but the entire sea. You could walk from Germany to Sweden on ice thick enough to support loaded wagons. It happened again in 1408 and 1423. Events that should have been once-in-a-millennium occurrences were becoming routine. The geography of Europe was being rewritten by cold. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries became impassable. Not just difficult, but literally impossible to traverse during winter months that now stretched from October to May. The economic integration that had been building throughout the High Middle Ages suddenly reversed. Regions that had been connected found themselves isolated. Local self-sufficiency became mandatory, not optional, but many localities couldn't achieve it. They'd specialized in particular products, depending on trade to acquire what they didn't produce. When trade stopped, they starved. The cities faced unique challenges. Urban populations depend entirely on food brought in from surrounding countryside. When agricultural production collapsed, cities couldn't eat. Urban mortality rates climbed steeply during the worst years. The cities that survived were those with aggressive procurement programs, essentially forcing the countryside to deliver food, even when rural communities were themselves starving. The resentment this created would fuel social conflicts for generations. Technology helped, where it could. Watermills, crucial for grinding grain, kept working even when rivers froze, because medieval engineers developed ways to position mills where water kept flowing. Windmills became more common, providing grinding capacity that didn't depend on unfrozen water. These innovations sound minor, but they meant the difference between communities that could process grain into flour and communities that couldn't, which meant the difference between survival and starvation. The church tried to respond. Monasteries had always served as refuges during hard times, providing food and shelter to travelers and locals in need. During the worst years of the Little Ice Age, they were overwhelmed. Monastic granaries that had seemed inexhaustible were emptied in weeks. Abbeys that had housed dozens of monks reduced their numbers because they couldn't feed everyone. Some monasteries collapsed entirely, their communities dispersing when resources ran out. Religious explanations for the climate crisis competed with each other. Some preachers declared that God was punishing humanity for sin and called for repentance. Others argued that the cold was a test of faith that Christians must endure with patience. A few suggested that the end times were approaching, that the world was literally growing old and cold as it prepared for final judgment. None of these explanations offered practical help, but they provided psychological frameworks for understanding suffering that otherwise seemed meaningless. Then 1347 arrived, and with it, something that would make even the worst years of cold and hunger seem almost bearable in retrospect. The plague ships were coming, carrying death in their holds. But they weren't sailing into a healthy, prosperous Europe that could mount an effective response. They were arriving at a civilization that had been weakened, starved, disrupted, and traumatized by decades of climate crisis. The cold had set the stage. Now the plague would exploit every vulnerability those years of suffering had created. The ships arrived at Messina in October 1347. Genoese trading vessels, fleeing from a Mongol siege at Kaffa on the Black Sea. The sailors were already dying. Black swellings in their necks and groins, fever, delirium, blood seeping from their skin. The Sicilians drove them away, but it was already too late. The rats had come ashore. We need to understand what these rats meant in medieval context. They weren't just disease vectors in the modern sense. They were everywhere, constantly, in numbers that would horrify us today. Medieval grain storage was essentially rat habitat with human guards. Every ship was a floating rat colony. Every house in every city sheltered populations of them. Medieval people accepted this the way we accept traffic noise, as an unpleasant but unchangeable feature of daily life. But these rats were different. They carried fleas. The fleas carried Yersinia pestis, a bacterium perfectly adapted to exploit the vulnerabilities that decades of climate crisis had created. The disease moved faster than anything in human experience. From Messina, it spread across Sicily in weeks. By January 1348, it had reached the Italian mainland. By spring, it was in France. Summer brought it to England. Autumn saw it penetrating Germany and Scandinavia. Within 18 months, it had covered territory that would have taken a fast rider years to traverse. The speed defied every medieval understanding of disease. Physicians had theories, all of them wrong. Miasma rising from the earth, planetary alignments, divine punishment. They prescribed treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Bleeding patients who were already losing blood. Burning aromatic herbs to purify the air. Fleeing to the countryside, which just spread the disease faster. Nobody understood that the real carriers were the fleas, that the disease could spread through droplets in the air when patients coughed, that the rats didn't even need to be near humans for transmission to occur. Medieval medical knowledge, sophisticated as it was in some areas, had no framework for understanding what was killing them. The symptoms were horrifying. The buboes that gave the disease its name, swellings in lymph nodes that could grow to the size of apples. the fever that made patients feel like they were burning alive, the delirium that followed, then the bleeding, subcutaneous hemorrhages that turned skin black, hence the name that would stick, the Black Death. Most patients died within a week of showing symptoms. Some died faster, within 2 or 3 days. A few survived, though nobody knew why. There was no pattern to survival that medieval observers could identify. The young and healthy died as quickly as the old and weak. The rich perished alongside the poor. Priests succumbed while administering last rites. Physicians died treating patients. The mortality rate in affected areas reached levels that strained credibility. 50% in many regions, 60% in some cities. Entire villages simply ceased to exist, their populations wiped out completely. Contemporary chroniclers wrote numbers that modern historians initially dismissed as exaggeration, but archaeological evidence keeps confirming them. The death toll really was that bad. Europe had about 75 million people in 1347. By 1353, when the first wave of plague finally subsided, perhaps 25 million were dead. 1/3 of the entire population gone in 6 years. Try to comprehend what that means practically. Every third house empty, every family having lost multiple members, every profession short of workers, every church seeing its congregation decimated, every city with entire neighborhoods abandoned. This wasn't gradual decline that communities could adapt to. This was sudden, catastrophic collapse. The economic effects cascaded in ways that the climate crisis hadn't. Labor shortages became acute almost overnight. Fields went unplanted because there weren't enough workers to plant them. Harvests rotted because there weren't enough people to bring them in. Shops closed because their craftsmen were dead. Trade networks that had been disrupted by cold now collapsed entirely because there weren't enough merchants to operate them. The survivors faced a bizarre situation. Sudden wealth from inheritance. A serf might find himself the last living relative of multiple families, owning more land than he could possibly work. A craftsman's apprentice might inherit his master's workshop and tools while barely knowing the trade. Property values collapsed because there were more houses than people to live in them, but you couldn't eat property. The real currency became labor. A worker could demand wages that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Lords who had treated peasants as disposable found themselves competing for laborers. The whole social structure started shifting in ways that terrified the authorities. England tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through the Statute of Labourers in 1351. Workers ignored it. What were the authorities going to do? Execute them. There weren't enough workers as it was. Similar laws elsewhere in Europe failed just as completely. The economic reality was stronger than legal fiction. Labour was scarce, therefore labour was valuable, regardless of what laws said. The plague returned. That's what broke people. The first wave was devastating, but survivors could hope it was a one-time catastrophe. Then 1361 brought another outbreak, and 1369, and 1374. The disease became endemic, flaring up every few years. Each wave killed fewer people than the first, mainly because there were fewer people to kill, but the psychological impact was worse. This wasn't a disaster to survive. This was the new normal. Families stopped having children or had fewer. Why bring children into a world where they'd probably die young? The birth rate, already suppressed by malnutrition from the climate crisis, dropped further. Population decline accelerated. Europe wouldn't return to its pre-plague population levels until the 16th century. Some regions took even longer. The social order bent under pressures it was never designed to handle. The feudal system depended on abundant labour. Lords needed peasants more than peasants needed lords. That fundamental equation had reversed. Serfs could run away to cities where labour shortages meant no questions asked. They could demand better conditions, knowing they had options. The bargaining power that had always rested with landowners shifted, not completely, but enough to matter. Religious faith faced its greatest challenge since the Church's founding. God was supposed to protect the faithful. Prayer was supposed to matter. Piety should have counted for something. But the plague killed the devout as readily as the sinful. Priests who stayed to minister to the dying perished. Monks who maintained their charitable work succumbed. The righteous suffered alongside the wicked. Some people responded with increased religiosity. Flagellant movements swept across Europe, believers whipping themselves in public processions, trying to appease divine wrath through suffering. But others abandoned faith entirely. If God wouldn't protect you, why bother with worship? Church attendance in many areas never fully recovered. The Jews faced horror. They were blamed, accused of poisoning wells to cause the plague. Pogroms erupted across Europe. Entire Jewish communities were massacred by mobs looking for someone to punish, someone to make pay for the suffering everyone was experiencing. The fact that Jews died from plague at the same rates as Christians didn't matter to people desperate for explanations and revenge. Medicine changed, though not in ways that actually helped plague victims. Physicians started wearing the beaked masks we associate with plague doctors. The beaks filled with aromatic substances to ward off miasma. The costumes were useless against the actual disease, but became symbols of medical authority responding to crisis. Medical schools expanded, training more doctors to replace those who died. The profession became more formalized, more credentialed, more concerned with theoretical knowledge, none of which helped patients survive. Medical treatment remained essentially ineffective against plague until the modern era. What changed wasn't cure rates, but the social status of physicians, who emerged from the plague years with enhanced prestige despite their inability to actually save people. Art transformed. Paintings before the plague showed idealized figures, religious scenes of beauty and divine grace. Art after the plague became obsessed with death. The dance of death motif appeared everywhere, showing skeletons leading people from all social classes to their graves. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a dominant theme. European culture couldn't look away from mortality anymore. Literature changed too. The Canterbury Tales, written in the plague's aftermath, shows characters trying to distract themselves with stories while travelling through a dangerous world. The Decameron explicitly frames itself as stories told by nobles hiding from the plague in a country villa. These weren't subtle influences. Writers were processing trauma directly. Architecture shifted in subtle ways. Churches built before the plague emphasized height and light, reaching toward heaven. Churches built after became heavier, more concerned with creating protected spaces. The vertical aspiration gave way to horizontal defensiveness. You can track the plague's psychological impact in stone. Crime rates actually dropped in many areas, not because people became more moral, but because there weren't enough people to form criminal gangs. The authorities were so overwhelmed with basic survival that enforcement became sporadic, yet paradoxically, civil order mostly held. The apocalypse everyone feared, total social breakdown, never quite materialized. Communities adapted, marriage patterns changed. People married younger, trying to rebuild populations. Widows and widowers remarried quickly, sometimes within weeks of losing spouses. The social stigma against rapid remarriage disappeared. Survival required it. Families needed to be reconstituted fast. Education suffered. Universities closed during plague outbreaks. Students dispersed. Professors died. The chain of knowledge transmission broke in many fields. Entire specialties disappeared because the few people who understood them all died before teaching anyone else. Medieval Europe lost knowledge that wouldn't be recovered for centuries. The climate crisis continued throughout all of this. The cold didn't stop because the plague arrived. Harvests still failed. Storms still destroyed crops. But now, there were fewer people trying to farm more land with depleted resources. The agricultural challenges that had seemed insurmountable before the plague became somewhat more manageable simply because there were so many fewer mouths to feed. This created a strange paradox. Individual survivors often found their lives improving materially. More food per person, higher wages, better housing, since you could move into a dead family's better house. The average surviving peasant in 1355 probably ate better and lived more comfortably than their grandparents had in 1300. But they lived in a world of ghosts, surrounded by emptiness and loss. Villages consolidated. When a settlement lost half its population, the survivors often moved to neighboring villages rather than trying to maintain an undermanned community. This created ghost villages, abandoned settlements that slowly returned to forest. Archaeologists keep finding them, sites where medieval life simply stopped mid-14th century and never resumed. The abandoned farmland created opportunity for different land use. Sheep pasture requires fewer workers than grain farming. England's wool industry expanded into regions that had grown wheat before the plague. This shift would have enormous economic consequences, laying groundwork for England's later textile dominance. But in the moment, it was just practical adaptation to labour shortages. Technology development slowed. Innovation requires surplus, people with time to experiment. When everyone's focused on immediate survival, long-term development stops. The mechanical and engineering advances that had characterized the 12th and 13th centuries largely halted. Europe went into a kind of technological holding pattern that would last until the Renaissance. Political structures weakened. Kings depended on tax revenue from populations that had shrunk by a third. They depended on armies recruited from populations that had shrunk by a third. Their administrative capacity collapsed as clerks and officials died. Royal authority became more theoretical, less practical. Local lords gained power relative to central authorities. The 100 Years' War between England and France continued throughout the plague, which seems insane until you understand that stopping required more political capital than continuing. Both sides kept fighting, with smaller armies, less frequently, but the conflict ground on. National rivalries didn't pause for pestilence. The plague's economic disruption created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. A smart peasant could accumulate enough wealth to buy land, becoming part of the yeoman class. A clever merchant could exploit trade disruptions to build fortune. The rigid social hierarchy started developing cracks. The church's wealth became problematic. Monasteries had survived by hoarding resources. During the plague, this looked like selfishness. Why were abbeys sitting on full granaries while nearby villages starved? The church's reputation suffered in ways that would eventually contribute to the Reformation, though that was still distant. By 1353, the first wave had passed. Europe began taking stock of what remained. The landscape was transformed, the population decimated, the economy in ruins, the social order questioned, religious certainty shaken. But people survived. They adapted. They began rebuilding. They had no choice. The cold still gripped the continent, and now they faced it with a fraction of their former numbers, trying to maintain a civilization that suddenly seemed too large for the people left to operate it. The survivors of the first plague wave faced an impossible question. Should they prepare for another outbreak, or assume it was finished? They chose wrong. The disease returned in 1361, what chroniclers called the Children's Plague, because it hit young people especially hard. Anyone born after 1348 had no immunity. This wave killed fewer people, maybe 15 to 20% of the remaining population. But that's misleading. It wasn't less devastating. It was devastating to what remained. A village that lost half its people in 1348 and then lost a quarter of the survivors in 1361 was functionally destroyed, even if technically inhabited. The psychological impact of the second wave might have exceeded the first. The first plague was unprecedented horror, but people could tell themselves it was unique, a singular catastrophe that wouldn't repeat. The second wave destroyed that hope. This was recurring. This was the new normal. How do you build a future when pestilence might return every decade? How do you invest in tomorrow when tomorrow keeps dying? The plague became endemic, returning in waves every 10 to 15 years throughout the rest of the 14th century. 1369, 1374, 1390. Each outbreak killed fewer people than the last, partly because population density had dropped, partly because some immunity was developing, partly because people learned avoidance behaviors. But each wave traumatized a generation, killed the vulnerable, and disrupted recovery. Economic adaptation accelerated after the second wave. Labor shortages weren't temporary anymore. They were permanent. Wages rose dramatically. A day laborer in 1370 earned twice what their grandfather had in 1340. This sounds good until you realize prices rose too, and the social contract binding society together was dissolving. Lords who couldn't pay higher wages lost workers. Estates that couldn't adapt failed. The entire feudal system depended on cheap agricultural labour, and suddenly labour wasn't cheap. England passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed completely. You can't legislate away supply and demand. Workers simply moved to estates that paid better, or they demanded illegal wages and got them because lords needed labour more than they needed to obey the law. The statute created resentment without solving the problem. Peasants who'd been told they were legally bound to their land discovered that law only mattered when it benefited the powerful. This realization fed directly into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. When you tell people they can't demand fair wages for decades, then they watch nobles ignore the same laws. Then you try to impose a poll tax that hits the poor hardest. Something breaks. The revolt was about many things, but labour rights were central. The plague had shown peasants their value. They wouldn't forget. France faced similar tensions with different results. French peasants revolted in 1358, the Jacquerie Uprising, which was suppressed with exceptional brutality. But the underlying issues didn't disappear. Lords needed workers. Workers knew their worth. The balance of power had shifted, and violence couldn't shift it back. Over time, French peasants gained more freedom not through successful rebellion, but through economic necessity making feudal restrictions impractical. Urban areas adapted faster than rural ones. Cities had always been more flexible, and the plague accelerated that. Guilds that had restricted membership to protect existing craftsmen suddenly needed new members. Apprenticeships shortened. Foreigners got accepted. Women entered trades previously closed to them. This wasn't progressive social policy, it was desperation. But desperation created opportunity. Women's economic position improved measurably. With so many men dead, women worked jobs that had been male only. Brewing, textile work, even some metalworking. Widows ran their dead husbands' businesses, and many succeeded. The legal restrictions remained. Society still viewed women as subordinate, but practical reality shifted. A widow running a profitable workshop commanded respect that theory said she shouldn't have. This didn't produce modern feminism. Medieval people didn't think in those terms, but it did produce women with economic independence, property rights, and business expertise. These women raised daughters who expected more freedom than their grandmothers had. Cultural change happened slowly, but the plague's disruption started processes that would take centuries to fully unfold. Technology started advancing again by the 1370s. The initial shock had passed. Survivors needed solutions to labour shortages, which drove innovation. Water-powered mills became more common. Mining techniques improved. Agricultural tools got better. The printing press wouldn't arrive for another 70 years, but the economic pressures that would make it necessary were building. When labour is expensive, you find ways to do more with less. The climate added another layer of difficulty. The Little Ice Age didn't end. If anything, conditions worsened through the late 14th century. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests failed more frequently. Winters grew harsher. The combination of reduced population and worse climate meant Europe's agricultural capacity dropped below even the diminished population's needs. Food security remained precarious for decades. This drove continued urbanization. Cities could stockpile food more effectively than scattered villages. They offered economic opportunities that agriculture couldn't match. Urban populations recovered faster than rural ones, shifting Europe's demographic balance in ways that would define the coming centuries. The medieval world had been overwhelmingly rural. The post-plague world became progressively more urban. Trade networks rebuilt, but differently. The old routes had depended on bulk goods and thin margins. Post-plague trade focused on high-value items that justified the risk and expense of transport through depleted regions. Spices, silk, precious metals, luxury textiles. This shift benefited Italian merchants especially, since they controlled Mediterranean trade routes. Venice and Genoa grew wealthy, while northern European cities struggled. The Hanseatic League, that confederation of northern trading cities, adapted by tightening control over Baltic trade. They monopolized grain shipments, fish, timber, furs. Their power grew because they controlled necessities that depleted populations desperately needed. The League became almost a state unto itself, with its own military and diplomatic corps, filling power vacuums that plague had created. Banking evolved rapidly. With so much property changing hands through death and inheritance, legal and financial mechanisms for managing wealth became crucial. Italian banks, particularly the Medici, developed sophisticated instruments for managing long-distance trade and currency exchange. Double-entry bookkeeping spread. Bills of exchange became common. The financial infrastructure of early capitalism was being built in plague-ravaged Europe. Religious life transformed in unexpected ways. The Church's authority had been challenged by its inability to stop the plague or adequately explain it. Some people became more devout, seeking salvation more desperately. Others became less religious, figuring that if prayer couldn't stop plague, why bother? Both responses reshaped European spirituality. Mysticism flourished. Individual spiritual experience gained value relative to institutional religion. Mystics like Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena claimed direct communication with God, bypassing church hierarchy. Their writings gained audiences because formal theology had failed to make sense of recent catastrophe. People wanted meaning, and personal revelation offered it, where official doctrine didn't. Flagellant movements emerged and re-emerged. Groups of believers would travel between towns, publicly whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. Church authorities opposed this, seeing it as competition, but couldn't completely suppress it. The impulse to do something, anything, to appease divine wrath, was too strong. If the church couldn't provide answers, people would find their own. Anti-Semitic violence continued sporadically. The initial wave of 1348 to 49 had been the worst, but suspicion remained. Whenever plague returned, some communities looked for scapegoats. Jewish communities had been devastated by the initial violence, and many never recovered. The Jewish population of Germany didn't return to pre-plague levels until the 19th century. The cultural and intellectual loss was incalculable. Art reflected the trauma. Paintings from the late 14th century show an obsession with death. Dance macabre images showing death dancing with people of all social classes became common. The message was egalitarian in the grimmest way possible. Death comes for everyone, rich and poor, powerful and weak. Medieval art had always acknowledged mortality, but post-plague art wallowed in it. Literature shifted toward darker themes. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, used it as framing device for stories about human behaviour under extreme circumstances. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380s, reflected a world where traditional hierarchies were questioned and ordinary people told their own stories. The confident medieval worldview was cracking. Architecture changed too. Building projects that had begun before the plague were completed in modified form or abandoned. Cathedrals that would have taken 50 years to build with adequate labour force now took 80 or 100. Some were never finished. You can still see churches in Europe where the architectural style changes midway up the walls, marking where pre-plague construction stopped and post-plague work began. Universities suffered and adapted. Student populations crashed when the plague hit, and many institutions closed temporarily. Those that survived often had to relax entrance requirements. The curriculum shifted slightly toward practical knowledge. Medicine gained emphasis, though medieval medicine couldn't actually help plague victims. Legal studies grew because property law had become incredibly complicated with so many estates in dispute. The university system's recovery was uneven. Paris and Oxford survived and eventually thrived. Smaller institutions vanished. New universities were founded in the late 14th century, often in cities that had never had them before. Prague got Charles University in 1348, right as the plague arrived. Krakow's university was founded in 1364. These new institutions served regional needs that the old system couldn't meet after losing so many scholars. Medical theory struggled with plague's implications. Galen's humoral theory, which had dominated for centuries, couldn't explain the disease's behaviour. Doctors proposed new theories, most wrong, but the willingness to question ancient authorities was significant. Medical knowledge didn't advance much in the 14th century, but medical epistemology did. Doctors started valuing observation over received wisdom, at least sometimes. Public health measures developed slowly. Milan's response to plague, closing the city and quarantining infected houses, was remembered as relatively successful. Other cities tried similar approaches in later outbreaks. Quarantine became standard practice, though its effectiveness was limited by incomplete understanding of disease transmission. Still, the principle that collective action could limit disease spread was established. This was the beginning of public health as a governmental responsibility. Sumptuary laws became common. These regulations specified what clothing and luxuries different social classes could own. Officially, this was about maintaining proper social hierarchy. Actually, it was about controlling new wealth. When plague survivors inherited multiple estates, when craftsmen demanded high wages, when merchants made fortunes in disrupted markets, old hierarchies crumbled. The nobility tried to use law to maintain distinctions that economics was eroding. These laws failed mostly. You can't legislate social stasis during economic revolution. A rich merchant would pay the fine for wearing silk and keep wearing it. A peasant who owned 2 farms would build a house that looked suspiciously noble. The laws revealed anxiety more than they controlled behavior. The social order was changing, and everyone knew it. Military technology and tactics evolved. Smaller armies meant different strategic possibilities. The longbow's dominance in English armies was partly about making fewer men more effective. Swiss pike formations served similar purposes. Gunpowder weapons started appearing in European warfare in the late 14th century, though they weren't yet decisive. The trend toward professionalization accelerated. Mercenary companies became more important than feudal levies. The 100 Years' War's character changed. Early battles like Crécy and Poitiers were massive engagements. Later 14th century campaigns involved smaller forces, longer sieges, more raiding. Partly this reflected population loss. Partly it showed evolving military thinking. The chevauchée, the destructive raid through enemy territory, became standard practice. Armies couldn't conquer territory when they couldn't garrison it, so they destroyed it instead. Naval warfare expanded. Control of sea routes mattered more when land routes were depopulated and dangerous. The Venetian-Genoese wars of the 1370s and 1380s were fought primarily at sea. The Hanseatic League maintained warships to protect Baltic trade. England's naval power grew relative to its land forces. The maritime focus that would characterize the later age of exploration was beginning. By the 1380s, Europe had adapted to its reduced circumstances. This wasn't recovery. The population wouldn't return to pre-plague levels until the 16th century. But it was stabilization. Society had reorganized around new realities. The economy functioned, if differently. Political structures held, if weakened. Culture continued, if transformed. People born after 1360 knew only post-plague world. To them, this was normal. Their grandparents' stories about the time before seemed like myths about a lost golden age that probably hadn't been that golden anyway. The survivors had survived, and now their children were building something new from the pieces that remained. The generation that came of age in the 1390s inherited a world nobody had planned. Their parents had survived catastrophe. They were building careers in its aftermath. This made them different. Not traumatized like their elders, but shaped by scarcity they'd never known anything but. A lawyer in Bruges, born in 1365, grew up when half the houses stood empty. Normal to him. He bought property cheap, married well, made partner young. The plague created his opportunities. He didn't think about it that way. This was just how the world worked. Social mobility wasn't new. It was faster. A merchant family could reach minor nobility in 2 generations instead of 4. A skilled craftsman could own a shop at 25 instead of 40. These weren't exceptional cases. They were patterns. The ladder had fewer rungs, but you climbed quicker. The distance between bottom and top hadn't shrunk. The middle had gotten wider and more accessible. Women's economic position showed the most dramatic shifts. Widows had always worked, but now they owned businesses. Guild records from the 1390s list women as masters in several trades. Not many, but more than before. Brewing became female-dominated in some regions. Textile work had always included women, but now they controlled more of the process. This wasn't feminism. Nobody was arguing for equality. It was pragmatic. Work needed doing, and gender restrictions were luxury people couldn't afford. Consider the situation of a widow in Cologne around 1395. Her husband had been a goldsmith. Normally, the guild would expect her to remarry another goldsmith or sell the business. But there weren't enough goldsmiths. She knew the craft. She'd worked alongside her husband for years. The guild accepted her as master. She trained apprentices, fulfilled commissions, voted in guild meetings. When she died 20 years later, her daughter inherited the workshop. This pattern repeated across professions. Women ran taverns, managed estates, operated as money lenders. The legal theory said they shouldn't. The practical reality said they had to. Theory bent. Not everywhere, not consistently, but noticeably. Later centuries would restrict these freedoms again. The window of opportunity was temporary, but it demonstrated that gender restrictions were social constructs, not natural laws. People noticed this, even if they didn't say it explicitly. Urban planning changed. Cities stopped expanding outward and started rebuilding inward. Empty plots within walls got repurposed. Gardens appeared in what had been dense housing districts. Some cities tore down outer walls that no longer made sense to defend. Nuremberg's population dropped from maybe 40,000 to 15,000. The city didn't need its full fortifications. They maintained the inner walls and let outer sections decay. Public spaces increased. Market squares got bigger. Churches added chapels rather than building new churches. The physical city reflected its smaller population. But this created pleasanter urban environments. Less crowding, more light, better sanitation. The Black Death survivors lived in more comfortable cities than their grandparents had. Dark irony that. Housing quality improved across classes. Peasants who'd lived in one-room hovels inherited multi-room houses. They didn't maintain all the rooms. They used one for living, one for storage, let others sit empty. But the potential was there. Construction techniques improved as labour costs forced efficiency. Buildings from the late 14th century show better carpentry and more sophisticated joinery than earlier structures. Expensive labour meant doing it right the first time. Urban-rural relationships transformed. Cities couldn't dominate their hinterlands like before. They needed the countryside's agricultural production, but couldn't compel it. This created more balanced exchange. Cities offered markets, manufactured goods, legal services. Villages provided food, raw materials, labour. Neither side could dictate terms completely. The relationship became more negotiated, less coercive. Some villages vanished entirely. Marginal farmland that made sense when population was high became unviable when labour was scarce. People abandoned poor soil, consolidated in fertile areas. England lost perhaps 1,500 villages between 1350 and 1450. Germany lost more. The abandoned sites left archaeological puzzles. Modern researchers find village footprints with no historical records of why people left. They left because staying made no sense. The survivors clustered where farming was easiest. This created localized population density. A valley might empty while the village at its mouth thrived. Geography mattered more. When you couldn't farm everywhere, you farmed the best land intensively. This was economically rational, but socially disruptive. Families left ancestral homes. Communities dissolved. The landscape itself changed as abandoned fields returned to forest. Religious life continued adapting. The flagellant movements of the 1350s had faded, but their emotional intensity influenced mainstream devotion. Personal, affective piety became more common. People wanted direct connection with the divine, less mediated by institutional hierarchy. This wasn't heresy exactly, but it pushed boundaries. Mysticism flourished. Julian of Norwich's visions in the 1370s and 1380s emphasized God's love and motherhood. This was radical theology, though she couched it in orthodox language. Catherine of Siena's letters influenced papal politics. She had no official authority, but people listened. A young woman mystic could shape international affairs because spiritual authority operated on different principles than institutional authority. The church hierarchy noticed this shift uneasily. More lay literacy meant more people reading scripture themselves. More direct devotion meant less dependence on priestly mediation. The institutional church wasn't declining in the late 14th century. It was being supplemented by parallel religious structures that operated semi-independently. This would cause problems later. Pilgrimage increased. People travelled to shrines seeking intercession, healing, or just spiritual experience. The economics of pilgrimage routes shaped regional development. Towns on major pilgrimage paths prospered. They built churches, hospitals, taverns. Santiago de Compostela's economy depended on pilgrims walking the Camino. Jerusalem remained the ultimate destination, but getting there was expensive and dangerous. Closer shrines worked fine for most people. Art production shifted. Fewer massive church projects meant more private commissions. Wealthy merchants wanted paintings, sculptures, illuminated books. This created market for portable art. The painting you could hang in your house became more important than the fresco in the church you couldn't own. Artistic style became more individualized. Less anonymous workshop production, more named artists with recognizable styles. The international Gothic style emerged in the 1390s. It spread across Europe because artists traveled seeking commissions. They carried sketchbooks, shared techniques, worked in multiple courts. This created surprising uniformity. A painting from Prague could look like one from Paris. The style featured elongated figures, rich colours, elaborate detail. It was beautiful, decorative, expensive, perfect for the merchant class trying to display refinement. Literature diversified. Chaucer, writing in English instead of French or Latin, was part of larger pattern. Vernacular literature gained prestige. Dante had written in Italian. Petrarch wrote Latin for prestige, but Italian for poetry. By the 1390s, writing in vernacular wasn't conceding inability to write Latin, it was choosing your audience deliberately. The Canterbury Tales showed this world's texture. Chaucer's pilgrims represented different social types, all travelling together. The framework acknowledged social hierarchy, but gave everyone voice. The knight and the miller told different kinds of stories, but both told stories. This was fiction, but it reflected reality. Rigid social boundaries were softening, not disappearing, but becoming more permeable. Music theory advanced. Ars Nova techniques developed in France spread across Europe. More complex rhythms, richer harmonies, sophisticated notation. This was technical progress, but it reflected broader intellectual culture. Musicians were theorizing about their art, writing treatises, teaching systematically. Music was becoming a studied discipline, not just performed craft. Secular music gained status. Courts employed musicians for entertainment, not just churches employing them for liturgy. Songs about courtly love, dancing, drinking. This wasn't crude popular music versus refined church music. It was sophisticated secular composition that required trained musicians. The boundary between sacred and profane culture was blurring. Education expanded differently than before. Universities had existed since the 12th century, but the late 14th century saw new patterns. More students from merchant families, fewer from nobility. Law and medicine attracted more interest than theology. Universities were becoming professional training grounds, not just intellectual communities. This was practical. You studied to get a career, not just to learn. Literacy spread beyond clergy and nobility. Merchants needed to read contracts. Craftsmen needed to read guild regulations. Women needed to manage household accounts. Reading became functional skill, not mark of elite status. This was gradual. Most people remained illiterate. But the literate minority was growing and diversifying. Libraries expanded. Private book ownership increased among wealthy merchants. Books were still expensive, still hand-copied, but more accessible than before. A rich merchant might own a dozen books. His grandfather might have owned none. This changed intellectual culture. You could think about ideas at home, not just in monastery or university. Private study became possible for non-clergy. Time measurement changed. Mechanical clocks appeared on church towers in 14th century. They didn't keep time accurately by modern standards, but they standardized it locally. Everyone in town heard the same bells marking hours. This created synchronized schedules. Markets opened at specific times. Courts convened at specific times. Work started and stopped by clock rather than sun. This seems minor. It was fundamental. Abstract time, divorced from natural rhythms, enabled different social organization. You could plan meetings, schedule production, coordinate activities. The mechanical clock was prerequisite for modern economic organization. It appeared just when Europe needed to organize more efficiently with fewer people. Banking evolved. Italian banking families had operated internationally since the 13th century, but the late 14th century saw new techniques. Double-entry bookkeeping became standard. Bills of exchange enabled long-distance transactions. Insurance contracts spread risk. These weren't just technical innovations. They were conceptual frameworks for thinking about economic activity abstractly. Credit expanded. More transactions happened on credit rather than immediate payment. This required trust and documentation. Legal systems developed to enforce contracts. The economic infrastructure we think of as modern was being built. Slowly, incompletely, but definitely. Currency remained confusing. Every principality minted coins. Exchange rates fluctuated. Merchants needed to calculate constantly. This created opportunities for specialists, money changers, exchange bankers, currency traders. A whole profession existed just to navigate monetary complexity. This was inefficient. It was also sophisticated. You needed mathematical skill and market knowledge. Money changing was intellectual work. Trade patterns reorganized. The Italian cities still dominated Mediterranean trade. The Hanseatic League controlled Baltic trade, but Atlantic trade was growing. Portuguese sailors were exploring down African coast. English cloth was reaching Iberian markets. The economic center of gravity was shifting westward, not dramatically yet, but the direction was set. Colonial ambitions stirred. The Canary Islands saw European settlement attempts in the 14th century. Mostly failures, but the impulse was there. Europe was looking outward, seeking resources and markets. The age of exploration was still decades away, but its preconditions were forming. Smaller European population needed to trade farther to maintain prosperity. Military orders redirected. The Teutonic Knights had finished conquering Prussia. They ruled a state now, not just campaigning. The Knights Hospitaller controlled roads. These military religious orders were becoming territorial powers. They administered justice, collected taxes, conducted diplomacy. The line between crusading order and sovereign state blurred. This was weird hybrid of medieval and early modern governance. The 100 Years' War entered new phase. The 1390s saw extended truces. Both England and France were exhausted. Richard II of England married French princess in 1396, trying to establish lasting peace. It wouldn't work. The war would resume. But the attempt showed both sides recognized they couldn't continue indefinitely at previous intensity. English internal politics grew turbulent. Richard II's increasingly autocratic rule alienated nobles. His conflict with Henry Bolingbroke would explode in 1399 with Richard's deposition. This was constitutional crisis. Kings didn't just get deposed. Except now, they did. The plague social disruption had weakened traditional authority structures. Political conflict became more volatile. The French monarchy struggled differently. Charles VI's madness, beginning in 1392, created succession crisis. Who ruled when king was incapacitated? His brother? His wife? The Council of Nobles? France had no clear answer. Different factions claimed authority. This would lead to civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians. Political instability compounded economic and social disruption. The papal schism continued. 2 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon. Neither could establish universal authority. Christendom was divided. This wasn't doctrinal dispute. Both sides held orthodox theology. It was political conflict dressed in religious language, but it weakened papal authority generally. If there could be 2 popes, maybe papal authority was less absolute than claimed. Efforts to resolve the schism failed repeatedly. Church councils met, negotiated, achieved nothing. The problem was structural. Neither pope would voluntarily abdicate. Neither had power to force the other out. It would take another generation to resolve. Meanwhile, the institutional church looked confused and weak. This encouraged the semi-independent religious movements that were already developing. The Ottoman Empire expanded into Europe. They'd crossed into Balkans in 1350s. By 1390s, they controlled Bulgaria, threatened Hungary. This was new threat. European powers were too divided to coordinate response. Local kingdoms fell piecemeal. The Ottomans weren't raiding. They were conquering, settling, administering. They were building empire in Europe's backyard while European powers fought each other. Timur's conquests disrupted Asia. He wasn't directly threatening Europe, but his campaigns affected trade routes. Silk Road traffic became uncertain. This pushed European merchants to seek alternate routes. The Indian Ocean trade became more attractive. This encouraged exploration and naval development. Geopolitical pressures in Asia influenced European exploration patterns. Technology transfer accelerated. Europeans learned from Islamic world, from China, from India. Papermaking, gunpowder, navigational techniques, mathematical concepts. The late 14th century saw ideas moving faster across cultural boundaries. This wasn't peaceful exchange. It was often mediated by conflict and conquest, but information traveled regardless. The printing press was still decades away, but its preconditions existed. Demand for books was growing. Paper was available. Metalworking techniques were advancing. Block printing appeared in Europe in the 14th century. Movable type would follow. The knowledge economy was expanding. When Gutenberg set up his press in the 1450s, he was meeting existing demand, not creating new market. Scientific thinking evolved slowly. This wasn't scientific revolution yet. Aristotle remained dominant authority. But observation was gaining respect. Scholars challenged ancient texts when evidence contradicted them. Medical texts, geographical works, natural histories. The idea that you should check what Aristotle said against what actually happened was spreading. This was revolutionary epistemology in traditional framework. Mathematics advanced. Arabic numerals fully replaced Roman numerals for calculation. Algebra entered European curriculum. These were practical developments driven by commercial needs. Merchants needed to calculate quickly and accurately. The tools they developed enabled later theoretical advances. Applied mathematics preceded pure mathematics. The astrolabe became common. Sailors, scholars, even wealthy amateurs owned them. They weren't accurate by modern standards, but they enabled navigation and astronomical observation. Tools shape thinking. When more people could measure celestial positions themselves, they thought differently about cosmos. Direct observation challenged received authority. By 1400, Europe had rebuilt functional civilization from plague's wreckage. Not the same civilization. Something new, forged in crisis, adapted to reduced circumstances, but viable. The population was smaller, but systems worked. The economy functioned. Trade moved, governments governed, culture produced. This was the foundation for everything that followed. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration. They built on structures established in late 14th century. The generation that adapted to post-plague world created frameworks that enabled future expansion. They didn't intend this. They were solving immediate problems. But solving those problems required innovations that opened new possibilities. The early 15th century brought new dynasties, new conflicts, new patterns, but underneath, continuity. The structures built in previous decades persisted. England and France resumed their war. Henry V invaded France in 1415. Agincourt became legendary. Small English army defeated much larger French force. Longbows against cavalry, tactical innovation against traditional warfare. The victory didn't end the war, it extended it. Henry V died young. His infant son inherited 2 kingdoms. Regency governments proved unstable. Joan of Arc appeared. Peasant girl claiming divine visions. She rallied French forces. This shouldn't have worked. Medieval society didn't empower teenage peasant girls, but desperate times created openings. She lifted siege of Orleans. She got Charles VII crowned. Then she was captured, tried, burned. But the momentum shifted. France recovered. By mid-century, English held only Calais. The 100 Years' War ended not with treaty, but with exhaustion. Both kingdoms needed to rebuild. Internal conflicts replaced external ones. England got Wars of the Roses. France got centralization under Louis XI. Different paths, same pattern. Strong monarchy emerging from feudal chaos. The Holy Roman Empire fragmented further. No central authority. Local princes operated independently. Some territories were sophisticated states. Others were barely organized. The empire was legal fiction held together by ceremonial reverence for emperor who controlled little beyond his own domains. This wasn't weakness exactly. It was different model. Decentralized power could be resilient. No single point of failure, but it prevented coordinated action. Italy remained divided. Northern cities thrived commercially. Milan, Venice, Florence competed for dominance. Rome was papal territory, but popes were often absent. Naples was separate kingdom in south. This division enabled cultural flowering. Competition between cities drove patronage. Wealthy families commissioned art, architecture, scholarship to demonstrate prestige. The Medici in Florence became prototype. Banking family that became de facto rulers. They funded Brunelleschi, Donatello, later Michelangelo. Political power expressed through cultural patronage. The church struggled with legitimacy crisis. 3 popes became 2, then 1. Council of Constance resolved Great Schism in 1417. But the process revealed uncomfortable truth. Church councils could depose popes. This contradicted papal supremacy theory. If councils were superior to popes, where did authority ultimately rest? The question remained unresolved. Hussite wars erupted in Bohemia. Jan Hus had challenged church corruption. He was burned at Council of Constance. His followers rebelled. These weren't peasant uprisings. Bohemian nobility led resistance. They created independent church structure. They defeated multiple crusades. Eventually, they negotiated settlement. The precedent was established. Regional churches could break from Rome and survive. This foreshadowed Reformation. The Ottoman expansion accelerated. Constantinople fell in 1453. The Byzantine Empire ended after 1,000 years. This shocked Christian Europe. The great city, the Second Rome, was gone. Sultan Mehmed II renamed it Istanbul, made it his capital. The Ottomans weren't going away. They were permanent presence in Europe. Christian kingdoms had new neighbor, powerful, organized, expanding. Traditional crusading rhetoric continued, but nobody seriously planned to recapture Constantinople. The reality was accommodation and occasional conflict. Trade continued. Diplomacy happened. War occurred, but not continuous civilizational struggle that rhetoric suggested. Practical relations developed despite ideological opposition. The printing press arrived. Gutenberg's innovation around 1450 transformed information distribution. This wasn't sudden revolution. Manuscript culture didn't disappear overnight. But printed books multiplied rapidly. Cheaper, faster, more standardized. By 1500, millions of books existed. This enabled Reformation. It enabled scientific communication. It changed how knowledge worked. Ideas could spread faster than authorities could suppress them. Error could be corrected across multiple copies simultaneously. Scholarship became cumulative in new way. Eastern Europe developed distinct patterns. Poland-Lithuania formed union. Massive state, mostly agricultural, ethnically diverse. Hungary resisted Ottoman advance, became frontier kingdom, militarized, unstable. Russia emerged from Mongol domination. Moscow consolidated power over other Russian principalities. Ivan III married Byzantine princess, claimed to be Third Rome Fu, ter Constantinople's fall. Russian Orthodoxy became state religion with imperial pretensions. These Eastern kingdoms operated differently than Western ones. Less urbanized, less commercial, more dependent on landed nobility. But they were part of same European system, connected by trade, diplomacy, occasional warfare. The economy recovered from plague depression. Population grew slowly. Agricultural production increased. New lands were cultivated, techniques improved. Three-field rotation became standard. Farming was still subsistence-oriented, but surplus increased. This supported larger urban populations. Cities grew. Not to pre-plague levels yet, but growing. Urban culture became more complex. Guild systems organized production. Apprentice, journeyman, master. Quality standards enforced. Markets regulated. This created stable employment but limited innovation. Guild restrictions prevented rapid change. Banking developed sophisticated instruments. Bills of exchange enabled long-distance trade without moving gold. Double-entry bookkeeping appeared. These weren't just technical improvements. They changed how people thought about value, debt, profit. Capitalism was emerging within feudal structures. The two systems coexisted awkwardly. Wealth from trade challenged wealth from land. Merchants bought noble titles. Nobles invested in commerce. Social categories blurred. Art evolved rapidly in Italy. Perspective was mastered. Classical forms were studied and adapted. Patronage supported full-time artists. This wasn't just aesthetic development. It reflected changing worldview. The universe could be represented mathematically. Human form could be idealized according to proportions. Nature could be captured through observation and technique. These were philosophical claims expressed through painting and sculpture. Architecture followed similar path. Classical orders were revived. Brunelleschi's dome in Florence demonstrated engineering ambition. Buildings became statements about human capability. The Gothic style continued, but classical revival spread. This wasn't nostalgia. It was claiming Roman heritage for contemporary purposes. Music became more complex. Polyphony developed, multiple independent melodic lines woven together. This required sophisticated composition. It created new aesthetic possibilities. Music moved from purely religious function toward independent art form. Secular songs, complex motets, eventually opera. The tools of musical notation enabled this. You could write music down precisely. Composers could work out complex structures on paper. Literature shifted toward vernacular languages. Dante had written in Italian a century earlier. Now Chaucer wrote in English. Vernacular wasn't just translation of Latin learning. It enabled different kinds of expression. Local, specific, accessible to non-clerical audiences. This democratized culture gradually. Education expanded slowly. Universities multiplied. Grammar schools appeared in towns. Still tiny minority was literate, but the minority grew. This created larger audience for written materials. When printing arrived, demand existed. The audience shaped what got printed. Popular works, practical manuals, religious texts. Not just scholarly treatises. Science remained embedded in philosophy. Alchemy, astrology, medicine blended observation with theory in ways modern science would reject. But the empirical tendency strengthened. Dissection became accepted in medical schools. Anatomical knowledge improved. This required overcoming religious objections to cutting corpses. The justification was practical. Better anatomy meant better surgery. Gradually, direct observation gained authority over ancient texts. Navigation drove technical development. Portuguese explored African coast. They needed better maps, better instruments, better ships. Each voyage generated information for next one. This was systematic knowledge accumulation. The caravel was developed. Ship that could sail against wind, explore coastlines, return home. Technology enabled expansion, which drove further technical development. The compass became standard. Magnetic declination was discovered. Sailors learned it didn't point true north. This required mathematical correction. Navigation became applied science. Cartography improved. Maps became more accurate. Portolan charts showed coastlines precisely. The world's shape was being documented. This information was valuable. Portuguese kept their maps secret. Knowledge was strategic resource. The astrolabe was refined for maritime use. Quadrant, cross-staff followed. These weren't perfect instruments, but they enabled calculation of latitude. Longitude remained unsolved problem for centuries. But knowing latitude was enormous improvement. Gunpowder weapons evolved. Early cannons were dangerous to users as to targets, but metallurgy improved. Cannon became reliable siege weapons. Castle walls that resisted trebuchets crumbled under bombardment. This changed military architecture. Star forts developed to deflect cannon fire. Warfare transformed. Handguns appeared. Arquebuses, muskets. They weren't accurate or fast, but they required less training than longbow. Armies could be equipped more quickly. This changed social composition of military forces. Professional soldiers replaced feudal levies gradually. Metallurgy advanced, driven by military demand. Better iron, better steel, better casting techniques. These improvements spread to other applications. Tools improved. Machinery improved. The same techniques that made better cannon made better plows. Technology transfer between military and civilian applications. Social mobility increased slightly. Merchant families entered nobility. Talented individuals could rise through church or royal service. This wasn't equality. Medieval society remained hierarchical, but hierarchy became less rigid. Achievement competed with birth. Wealth competed with lineage. The idea that your position was completely determined by birth was weakening. Women's positions varied by class and region. Queens could wield real power. Merchants' wives often managed businesses. Peasant women worked alongside men. But legal restrictions were pervasive. Women couldn't hold office, testify in court in many jurisdictions, control property after marriage. Convents offered alternative to marriage. Some women gained education and autonomy as nuns. Jewish communities faced periodic persecution, expulsions from various kingdoms. Spain expelled Jews in 1492. Many moved to Ottoman Empire, Poland, North Africa. Jewish scholars contributed to medicine, philosophy, commerce wherever they settled. But their position remained precarious. Islamic world experienced own transformations. Ottoman Empire expanded but also consolidated. Administrative systems developed. Devshirme system recruited Christian boys, converted them, trained them as soldiers or administrators. This created loyal bureaucracy without hereditary ambitions. Persia saw dynasty changes. Timur's descendants fought over his empire. Eventually Safavids emerged, established Shia Islam as state religion. This created permanent division with Sunni Ottomans. Religious difference reinforced political rivalry. India remained politically fragmented. Delhi Sultanate weakened. Regional kingdoms emerged, but trade continued. Indian Ocean commerce connected India to Southeast Asia, East Africa, Arabia. Indian textiles, spices were valuable commodities in global trade. China experienced dynastic transition. Ming dynasty replaced Mongol Yuan. This was return to native rule. Chinese identity reasserted. The Great Wall was rebuilt. Zheng He's voyages reached East Africa in early 15th century. Chinese fleet was larger and more advanced than any European navy. But then the voyages stopped. China turned inward. The decision wasn't inevitable. Different court faction could have continued naval expansion. Chinese ships could have reached Europe, but they didn't. Internal priorities shifted. Resources went to northern border defense. The maritime expeditions ended. This created opportunity for European expansion. When Portuguese reached Indian Ocean, they didn't find Chinese fleets. They found regional powers they could negotiate or fight with. If China had maintained naval presence, European expansion would have faced different obstacles. Africa remained largely unknown to Europeans. North Africa was part of Mediterranean world. East African coast had trading cities connected to Indian Ocean network, but interior was unmapped by outsiders. Europeans didn't penetrate beyond coastal forts until 19th century. Disease environment prevented European colonization. Malaria, yellow fever killed Europeans quickly. Africans had resistance Europeans lacked. This limited European presence to trading posts. African kingdoms controlled interior. They traded with Europeans when it benefited them. Americas remained isolated. No contact with Eastern Hemisphere since prehistoric migrations. Complex civilizations existed. Aztec, Inca, various North American cultures. They developed independently. Different crops, different animals, different diseases, different technologies. When contact came, the collision would be catastrophic. But in early 15th century, the two hemispheres developed separately. Neither knew the other existed. Global trade networks expanded. Silk Road revived partially after Mongol collapse. Indian Ocean trade grew. Mediterranean commerce connected Europe to Asian goods. These networks operated through chains of intermediaries. No single merchant traveled entire route. Goods passed through many hands. Each exchange added value and information. Technology spread along trade routes. Ideas followed commerce. Religious concepts, artistic styles, scientific knowledge moved between cultures. This wasn't peaceful exchange necessarily. War, conquest, forced migration also transmitted culture. But the result was cross-pollination. Climate remained variable. Little Ice Age began around 1300, continued for centuries. Growing seasons shortened. This affected agriculture. Northern Europe especially struggled. Wine production moved south. Grain harvests decreased. This created persistent pressure. Societies adapted. Different crops, different techniques. Trade to import food. But climate added stress to social systems already dealing with plague aftermath, political instability, economic change. Disease patterns shifted. Plague remained endemic. Outbreaks occurred regularly, but weren't as devastating as Black Death. Populations developed some resistance. Public health measures improved. Quarantine became standard practice. Cities maintained health boards. This was early epidemiology, empirical observation that isolation reduced spread. The theory was wrong. Miasma theory blamed bad air. But the practice worked anyway. By mid-15th century, Europe had rebuilt viable civilization from 14th century catastrophes. Different civilization than before, more urban, more commercial, more literate, more technologically sophisticated. The foundations for dramatic expansion existed: the tools, the knowledge, the economic systems, the political structures. Next phase would see these elements combine in ways nobody planned. Exploration, a reformation, scientific revolution. Each built on infrastructure created in post-plague recovery. Portuguese ships reached West Africa in 1440s. They weren't first Europeans there. North African trade routes had connected Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa for centuries. Gold, salt, slaves moved north across Sahara. But Portuguese approached from ocean. Different route, different dynamic. They built trading posts along coast. São Jorge da Mina in 1482. Direct access to gold supplies. Bypassing Muslim intermediaries who controlled trans-Saharan trade. This was revolutionary, not because Europeans were more advanced. Portuguese ships weren't superior to Arab dhows in many ways, but they provided alternative route. Competition changed economics. African kingdoms played European traders against each other, increased demand for slaves, not new institution. Slavery existed in Africa before Europeans arrived. Existed everywhere, actually. What changed was scale and destination. Trans-Saharan slave trade had moved perhaps 9 million people over 1,000 years. Atlantic trade would eventually dwarf that. But in 1440s, it was beginning. Few hundred people per year initially, growing steadily. The catastrophe was building incrementally. Each transaction seemed normal. Economic exchange between willing partners. The horror accumulated slowly, then explosively. Portuguese push south along African coast. Bartol, Omu Dias rounded Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Proved sea route to Indian Ocean existed. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. Direct maritime connection between Europe and Asia. This changed everything. Overland routes through Middle East suddenly had competition. Venetian merchants who controlled Mediterranean trade faced crisis. Their monopoly dissolved. Portuguese ships could sail directly to source. Spices, silk, other luxury goods could bypass traditional intermediaries. Economics of Asian trade transformed. But voyage was dangerous. Months at sea. Scurvy killed sailors. Navigation was imprecise. Many ships never returned. Yet profit margins were enormous. Single successful voyage could fund 10 failures. This encouraged risk-taking. More ships, more voyages, more knowledge. Each expedite, Tyan learned from previous mistakes. Charts improved. Sailing techniques developed. The learning curve was steep and bloody. Spanish looked west instead of south. Christopher Columbus proposed reaching Asia by sailing across Atlantic. The idea wasn't crazy. Educated people knew Earth was round, had known for centuries. Greek calculations were roughly accurate, but Columbus got the numbers wrong. He underestimated Earth's circumference significantly, thought Asia was much closer. If he'd been right about distance, his ships couldn't have made it. But he was lucky. Unknown continent existed where he thought empty ocean would be. He landed in Bahamas in 1492, thought he'd reached East Indies, hence Indians for indigenous people. The naming mistake persisted for centuries. Columbus made 4 voyages, explored Caribbean extensively, established colonies, brought European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus. Indigenous populations had no immunity. Death rates were catastrophic. Some estimates suggest 90% mortality in first century of contact. Not intentional genocide initially, just epidemiological disaster. Europeans didn't understand disease transmission. Germ theory wouldn't exist for centuries. But result was civilizational collapse. Complex societies disintegrated, cities emptied, agricultural systems failed. Survivors faced starvation, social breakdown. This created power vacuum. Europeans filled it. Not through military superiority alone. Disease did most of the killing. Other European explorers followed Columbus. John Cabot reached North America in 1497. Amerigo Vespucci explored South American coast. Realized it was separate continent, not Asia. Mapmakers named continents after him. America, historical accident of naming. Could have been Colombia or something indigenous, but wasn't. Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed Panama in 1513. Saw Pacific Ocean from American side. Confirmed 2 separate oceans existed. This raised obvious question. How wide was Pacific? Could ships cross it? Ferdinand Magellan attempted circumnavigation in 1519. Spanish expedition, Portuguese commander. 5 ships left Spain. 3 years later, 1 ship returned. Magellan died in Philippines, but expedition proved Earth could be circled by sea. Confirmed spherical geometry practically. Also demonstrated Pacific's enormous size, much wider than Atlantic. Asia and America were very far apart. This explained why Columbus's calculations failed. The world was bigger than anyone had realized. These voyages weren't exploration for knowledge's sake. They were commercial ventures, seeking profit through trade or conquest. Portugal wanted spice trade. Spain wanted gold and silver. England wanted fishing grounds and piracy opportunities. France wanted fur trade. Each power pursued different strategy, but all extracted resources from newly contacted regions. Impact on indigenous peoples was devastating. Not just disease, also forced labor, cultural destruction, political subjugation. Some groups resisted successfully for centuries, others collapsed quickly. Pattern varied by region, by disease exposure, by political organization, by European tactics. But overall trend was catastrophic foe, our indigenous populations. European expansion created first truly global trade network. Silver from Potosi in Bolivia moved to Spain, then to China via Manila galleons. Chinese silk went to Mexico. African slaves went to Brazil. Sugar from Caribbean went to Europe. Cod from Newfoundland fed Catholic Europe during Lent. This was world economy emerging. Not equal partnership, extremely unequal, but interconnected. Change in one region affected others. Price of silver in China influenced Spanish imperial finances. Demand for sugar in Europe drove slave trade in Africa and plantation agriculture in Americas. System had internal logic. Brutal logic, but coherent. Meanwhile, Reformation exploded across Europe. Martin Luther posted 95 Theses in 1517. Challenged Catholic Church's sale of II indulgences, wasn't intending to split Christianity, wanted reform within church, but printing press spread his ideas rapidly. Thousands of copies circulated within weeks. Previous heresies had been contained through censorship, but printing changed dynamics. Ideas replicated faster than authorities could suppress them. Luther's theology resonated. Salvation through faith alone. Scripture as sole authority. Priesthood of all believers. These concepts challenged church hierarchy fundamentally. If individual conscience mattered more than institutional authority, why obey Pope? Question had political implications beyond theology. German princes protected Luther. Partly religious conviction, partly political calculation. Challenging papal authority meant challenging Holy Roman Emperor. Reformation became excuse for asserting princely independence. Religious conflict merged with political struggle. This pattern repeated across Europe. Religion and politics intertwined inseparably. Henry VIII broke with Rome over marriage annulment. Personal issue became constitutional crisis. English Reformation was political before theological. Church of England maintained Catholic doctrine initially, just rejected papal authority. Later generations would reform theology. But initial split was about sovereignty. Who controlled English church, pope or king? Choice had implications for taxation, appointments, foreign policy. Religion touched everything. Switzerland developed different Protestant tradition. Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich, John Calvin in Geneva. Reformed tradition emphasized predestination, covenant theology, church discipline, created distinct Protestant culture, more austere than Lutheran, more democratic in church government, influenced Scotland, Netherlands, parts of France. Protestant diversity created problem. If rejecting papal authority was justified, what prevented endless fragmentation? Each reformer claimed biblical support, but they disagreed with each other. Who decided correct interpretation? Scripture alone didn't prevent splits. It enabled them. Catholic Church responded with counter-reformation. Council of Trent reformed practices, clarified doctrine. Jesuits became militant arm of Catholic renewal. Sophisticated theologians, effective educators, dedicated missionaries. They fought Protestantism, intellectually and spiritually, also politically. Catholic monarchs who remained loyal to Rome received support. Spain especially became defender of Catholic Christianity. This set up religious wars that would devastate Europe. 30 Years' War wouldn't start until 1618, but foundations were laid in 16th century. Religious division aligned with political conflicts. German princes fought emperor. French Catholics fought Protestants in civil wars. Netherlands revolted against Spa, Nish rule. England faced Catholic plots against Protestant Queen. Religion justified violence. Both sides claimed God's will. Printing press amplified conflict. Pamphlets spread propaganda. Theological treatises became bestsellers. Literacy increased partly because Protestants emphasized scripture reading. Everyone needed to read Bible themselves. This required education. Protestant regions invested in schools. Literacy rates climbed. Unintended consequence was more critical thinking. Once people learned to read, they read other things too, not just theology. Science, history, philosophy, information access expanded. This fed into intellectual ferment of 16th century. Renaissance continued in Italy. Art, architecture, literature flourished. Patronage system supported artists. Wealthy families competed for cultural prestige. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael created masterpieces. Their work drew on classical models, but exceeded them. Technical skill improved. Perspective, anatomy, composition. Artists studied nature directly. Empirical observation combined with mathematical theory. This was scientific method applied to art. Leonardo dissected corpses to understand muscles, studied bird flight to design flying machines. His notebooks showed mind that didn't separate art from science. Both required observing nature accurately. Renaissance humanism emphasized human potential. Classical texts were recovered from monasteries. Greek manuscripts brought from Constantinople after 1453 fall. Scholars learned Greek, translated works, Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's treatises. These texts offered alternatives to medieval scholasticism, different way of thinking about humanity's place in cosmos, less hierarchical, more individualistic. This influenced political theory. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, analyzed power pragmatically, separated politics from morality, shocking at the time, but influential. Rulers read it privately while condemning it publicly. It described how power actually worked, not how it should work ideally. This realism was new, or newly stated openly. Northern Renaissance differed from Italian, less focused on classical antiquity, more interested in Christian reform. Erasmus of Rotterdam criticized church corruption, wanted return to simple Christianity. His satire influenced Luther, though Erasmus himself stayed Catholic, preferred reform within church. Thomas More imagined utopia, ideal society based on reason and communal property, part satire, part serious proposal. Showed tension between Christian ideals and actual practice. More would be executed for refusing to accept Henry VIII's break with Rome. Principle cost him his life. Albrecht Dürer brought Renaissance techniques to German art. Detailed engravings showed mathematical precision. Combined Northern attention to detail with Italian compositional theories. Art became international. Techniques spread through prints. Artists travelled. Ideas circulated. This was cultural exchange on unprecedented scale. Science advanced through similar exchange. Nicholas Copernicus proposed heliocentric model. Earth orbited Sun, published 1543. Revolutionary idea, contradicted common sense observation. Sun appears to move, not Earth. But mathematics worked better with heliocentric model. Simpler calculations, fewer epicycles needed. Copernicus wasn't first to suggest heliocentrism. Ancient Greek astronomer Aristarchus had proposed it. But idea hadn't caught on. Now it did. Slowly. Most astronomers initially rejected it, required rethinking basic assumptions about cosmos. If Earth moved, why didn't we feel motion? Questions like this seemed unanswerable. But Model's mathematical elegance attracted some astronomers. Copernicus's work wasn't observational breakthrough. He used existing data, but reinterpreted it through different framework. This was theoretical revolution. Same observations, different explanation. Medical knowledge advanced. Andreas Vesalius published detailed anatomy text in 1543, based on human dissection, corrected Galen's errors. Galen had dissected animals, assumed human anatomy was similar, often wrong. Vesalius showed actual structure. This required overcoming taboos about dissecting human bodies. Medical schools obtained corpses of executed criminals. Students observed dissections, learned anatomy empirically, not from ancient texts. This was methodological shift. Trust observation over authority. Paracelsus challenged medical orthodoxy differently, rejected humoral theory, proposed chemical approach to medicine, thought diseases had specific causes, required specific remedies, not just balancing humours. His ideas seemed radical, but pointed toward modern pharmacology. He also emphasized experiment, test treatments, observe results. Don't just follow tradition. These developments shared common feature: emphasis on direct observation, question received wisdom, test theories against evidence. This wasn't yet scientific method as formalized later, but moving that direction. Natural philosophy was changing, becoming more empirical, less speculative. Technology improved through similar process, trial and error, incremental refinement. Printing press technology advanced, faster presses, better ink, movable type in more languages. Books became cheaper, print runs increased, more titles published. This accelerated information spread. Mining technology developed. Deeper shafts required better pumps. Water removal was a constant problem. Engineers designed mechanical pumps powered by water wheels or horses. This enabled extraction of ore from greater depths, increased metal supply. Metallurgy improved. Better furnaces produced stronger iron. Steel quality increased. This affected everything from armor to tools to weapons. Military technology advanced rapidly. Handguns became more reliable. Matchlock mechanism allowed one-handed operation. Rates of fire increased. Artillery grew more powerful. Cannons could breach medieval fortifications. This changed warfare fundamentally. Castles became obsolete. New fortification designs emerged. Trace Italienne. Star-shaped forts with angled bastions, designed to deflect cannon fire. Required different siege tactics. Military engineering became specialized field. Shipbuilding incorporated new techniques. Carvel construction replaced clinker. Smoother hulls, faster ships, multiple masts with different sail types. Ships could sail closer to wind, navigate more efficiently, carry more cargo. These improvements enabled longer voyages. Better ships made exploration possible. Agriculture adopted new crops from Americas: potatoes, maize, tomatoes. These would transform European diet. But adoption was slow. Peasants resisted novelty, preferred traditional crops, took generations for new foods to become accepted. Once they did, impact was enormous. Potatoes especially grew in poor soil, provided more calories per acre than grain, supported larger populations. This wouldn't show full effect until 18th century, but process began in 16th. Economic theories developed to explain new realities. Mercantilism emerged. Idea that national wealth came from trade surplus. Export more than import. Accumulate gold and silver. This justified colonial extraction. Colonies existed to benefit mother country, provide raw materials, consume manufactured goods. System was explicitly exploitative, but considered economically rational. Bullion theory said money supply determined national power. More gold meant more strength. This drove Spanish obsession with American silver. Massive quantities flowed to Spain, then distributed through European economy via trade and war spending. This caused inflation. Price revolution of 16th century. Too much money. C. Hazing too few goods. Real wages declined. This hurt workers, benefited landowners and merchants. Social tensions increased. Urban populations grew, not just from natural increase. Rural migrants sought opportunities in cities or fled rural poverty. Cities couldn't absorb everyone. Unemployment, poverty, crime increased. Authorities responded with poor laws, attempted to manage vagrant populations, distinguish deserving poor from idle. This rarely worked well, but showed recognition that poverty was a social problem requiring policy response. Plague returned periodically. Outbreaks in various cities, not continent-wide like Black Death, but devastating locally. Venice 1575, London 1563, Milan 1630. Cities implemented quarantines, isolated sick households. This limited spread somewhat. Public health infrastructure developed slowly. Hospitals were charitable institutions, not medical centres. Most healthcare happened at home. Midwives attended births. Barber surgeons handled injuries. Physicians treated wealthy. Medical marketplace was diverse, competition between different approaches. Learned medicine, folk remedies, religious healing, all coexisted. Witch hunts intensified. Both Catholic and Protestant regions prosecuted supposed witches. Peak period was late 16th and 17th centuries. Tens of thousands executed, mostly women, mostly old or marginal. Accusations often followed social conflicts, property disputes, personal grudges. Witch trials provided mechanism for communities to purge anxiety and settle scores. Legal procedures varied. Some regions used torture to obtain confessions. Others didn't. Some required material evidence. Others accepted spectral evidence. Witch hunts weren't medieval superstition surviving into modern age. They peaked during Renaissance and Reformation. Educated people believed in witchcraft, wrote learned treatises about it. This was early modern phenomenon, product of religious conflict, social stress, judicial procedures that enabled persecution. By late 16th century, European civilization had transformed dramatically since 1450. Politically fragmented but culturally interconnected. Religiously divided but economically integrated. Technologically sophisticated but socially stratified. These contradictions would drive next century's developments. The 17th century opened with Europe exhausted but unable to rest. 30 Years' War began 1618. Started as religious conflict in Holy Roman Empire, became general European war, Catholic versus Protestant initially, then political alliances cut across religious lines. Catholic France supported Protestant Sweden. Both fought Catholic Habsburgs. War devastated German territories. Armies lived off land, stripped regions bare. Populations declined dramatically. Some areas lost half their people. Disease, starvation, violence. Contemporary accounts describe horror. Villages abandoned, fields left untilled. Wolves returned to areas humans had inhabited for centuries. Peace of Westphalia. 1648 finally ended conflict, established principle of state sovereignty. Rulers could determine their territory's religion, but also recognized religious pluralism within empire. Complicated settlement. Took years to negotiate. Redrew political map. Sweden gained territory. France expanded eastward. Habsburg power checked. Empire became loose confederation. Individual German states gained autonomy. This fragmentation would persist until 19th century. England experienced its own upheaval. Civil war erupted 1642. Parliament versus King Charles I. Religious, political, constitutional issues combined. Puritans opposed Charles's religious policies. Parliament resisted his financial demands. Both sides raised armies. Initially, neither dominated. Then Oliver Cromwell organised new model army, professional force, ideologically motivated, defeated royalists. Charles was captured, tried, executed 1649. Shocking event. Anointed king put to death by subjects. challenged fundamental assumptions about monarchy. England became republic. Commonwealth period, but unstable. Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector, essentially military dictatorship. After his death 1658, system collapsed. Monarchy restored 1660. Charles II returned from exile. But precedent was set. Kings could be resisted, even removed. This would have implications for political theory. Absolute monarchy faced challenges. France under Louis XIV represented absolutist ideal. Sun King centralized power. Nobles became courtiers. Military power monopolized by state. Taxation systematized. Bureaucracy expanded. Versailles symbolized royal authority. Magnificent palace, center of political life. Louis controlled nobility through elaborate court ritual. Everyone competed for his attention. This kept them from conspiring against him. System was expensive. Constant wars drained treasury. Louis fought series of conflicts, expanded French borders, made France dominant European power. But costs were enormous. Taxation increased. This created resentment. Seeds of future revolution were planted, though that wouldn't come until next century. England took different path after Restoration. Parliament maintained significant power. Charles II needed parliamentary approval for taxation. This limited royal authority. James II succeeded 1685. Catholic king, Protestant nation, tensions inevitable. James alienated political class. Birth of his son 1688 meant Catholic succession. Protestant leaders invited William of Orange to invade. He did. James fled. Glorious revolution. Bloodless regime change. William and Mary accepted crown with conditions. Bill of Rights 1689. Parliamentary supremacy established. Monarchy became constitutional. King ruled with Parliament, not alone. This model would influence political development elsewhere, especially in North America. Colonies there were developing, own institutions. Distance from Europe created autonomy. Colonial assemblies claimed rights, modelled on English Parliament, tensions with royal governors. These would eventually lead to independence movements. But that's 18th century story. Scientific revolution accelerated. New discoveries challenged old certainties. Galileo observed moons orbiting Jupiter. This contradicted geocentric model. Earth wasn't center of everything. Catholic Church forced him to recant. But knowledge spread anyway. Kepler calculated planetary orbits. Elliptical, not circular, mathematical precision. Harvey described blood circulation, demonstrated heart was pump, overturned ancient theories. These discoveries were connected. New methods of investigation, emphasis on observation and experiment, not just reading ancient authorities. Royal Society founded London 1660. Scientific Academy. Members shared research. Peer review began. Knowledge became collaborative. International correspondence networks developed. Scientists across Europe exchanged letters, reported findings, debated theories. Republic of letters transcended political boundaries. Latin was common language. Educated people everywhere could read it. This facilitated knowledge transfer. Isaac Newton synthesized much previous work. Principia Mathematica 1687. Universal laws of motion, law of gravitation. Mathematics described physical reality. This was revolutionary. Nature operated according to laws, could be understood through reason. Implications were profound. If nature was rational, perhaps society could be too. Enlightenment thinking would develop from this. But Newton himself was religious, saw laws as evidence of divine design. Science and religion weren't yet opposed. Many scientists were devout, saw investigation of nature as studying God's creation. Conflict would develop later. Philosophy responded to new science. René Descartes developed rationalist method. I think, therefore I am. Certainty came from reason. Mathematics was model for philosophy, deduced truths from clear principles. This influenced subsequent thought. John Locke took a different approach. Knowledge came from experience. Mind was blank slate at birth. Sensation and reflection built understanding. This empiricism contrasted with rationalism. Both approaches influenced enlightenment. These philosophical developments had political implications. Locke argued for natural rights. Life, liberty, property. Government existed to protect these. If government failed, people could resist. Revolutionary idea, justified early. English actions would justify future American independence. Thomas Hobbes presented contrasting view. Leviathan, 1651. Natural state was war of all against all. People surrendered rights to sovereign in exchange for security, absolute authority necessary. Different conclusion from same starting point. Natural rights theory. These debates shaped modern political thought. Baroque culture dominated artistic expression. Dramatic, emotional, ornate. Catholic Church promoted it. Counter-Reformation strategy. Appeal to senses. Overwhelm with splendor. Baroque churches were theatrical. Sculptures seemed to move. Paintings created illusion. Architecture played with light and space. This wasn't just decoration. It communicated religious messages. Emotional engagement with faith. Bernini's sculptures exemplified style. Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Marble seems fluid. Saint's rapture visible. Combining artistic skill with religious intensity. Protestant regions developed different aesthetic. Simpler, more restrained. Reflected theological differences. Dutch painting showed domestic scenes. Vermeer's quiet interiors. Rembrandt's psychological portraits. Art served different purposes, not church decoration. Private purchase for homes. This reflected economic prosperity. Dutch Republic was commercial success, trade empire, banking centre. Amsterdam became financial capital, stock exchange, insurance companies. Joint stock companies enabled investment. VOC, Dutch East India Company. Shareholders owned enterprise. Profits distributed, risk spread. This was modern capitalism emerging, different from earlier merchant ventures. Systemic, institutional, not just individual traders. English established similar companies. East India Company, Hudson's Bay Company. These would build empires. Initially focused on trade, later became territorial powers. This process wasn't inevitable, developed gradually, through combination of commercial ambition and political vacuum in regions where European traders operated. Atlantic slave trade expanded horrifically. Sugar plantations in Caribbean required labor. Indigenous populations had collapsed. Africans were enslaved and transported. Middle Passage. Brutal voyage. Many died. Survivors faced terrible conditions. Worked to death on plantations, then replaced. This wasn't economically rational, just cruel. But plantation owners didn't care. Profits were enormous. Sugar consumption in Europe increased. Coffee, tea, chocolate became popular. All required sweetening. Demand drove supply. Millions were enslaved, families destroyed, cultures disrupted. This was genocide. Largest forced migration in history. Economic system built on human suffering. Some voices opposed slavery. Religious arguments. All humans had souls. Slavery violated Christian principles, but these were minority views. Most people accepted it, or profited from it, or just didn't think about it. Distance made it easier to ignore. Sugar arrived refined. Labor that produced it was invisible. This would continue until 19th century. Abolitionist movements eventually succeeded. But that took generations. Ottoman Empire remained major power, controlled Eastern Mediterranean, Balkans, Middle East, North Africa. But expansion had stopped. Siege of Vienna, 1683, failed. Polish-Austrian forces defeated Ottoman army. This marked turning point. Ottoman decline began, slowly at first. Internal problems accumulated. Military technology lagged. Janissaries resisted reform. Administrative corruption increased. Provincial governors became autonomous. Central authority weakened. This created opportunity for European expansion. Russia pushed south, gained Black Sea access. Austria expanded into Balkans. Ottoman territories gradually reduced. Process took centuries. Empire persisted until 20th century, but power diminished steadily. Mughal Empire in India reached peak under Aurangzeb, ruled 1658 to 1707, expanded territory, but policies created problems. Religious intolerance, persecuted Hindus, destroyed temples, imposed special taxes. This alienated majority population. Rebellions increased. Empire became overextended. After Aurangzeb's death, declined rapidly. Regional powers emerged, created political fragmentation. This enabled European intervention. British East India Company exploited divisions, gradually gained control, but that's 18th century development. China, under Qing dynasty, flourished. Manchu rulers had conquered Ming, initially faced resistance, but consolidated control. Kangxi Emperor ruled 1661 to 1722. Long successful reign, expanded territory, promoted learning. Economy prospered. Population grew. Agricultural improvements. New crops from Americas. Maize, sweet potatoes, grew in marginal land, fed more people. Commerce expanded. Silk, porcelain, tea exported. Silver imported, mainly from Japan and Spanish Americas. This connected China to global economy, but on China's terms. Controlled foreign trade, restricted to specific ports. Limited contact with Europeans. Chinese saw themselves as superior. Middle Kingdom, center of civilization. Barbarians on periphery. This attitude would create problems when European power increased. But for now, China was wealthier and more sophisticated than Europe. Japan closed itself to outside world. Tokugawa shogunate established 1603. Unified country after Civil War period. Imposed strict social order. Neo-Confucian ideology. Everyone had place. Samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants. Hierarchy was rigid, enforced by law. Christianity was banned, associated with European colonialism. Japanese Christians persecuted. Missionaries expelled, trade restricted. Only Dutch allowed. Single port, Nagasaki. This isolation lasted until 19th century. Sakoku policy, closed country. But Japan wasn't stagnant. Internal development continued. Urban culture flourished. Edo became world's largest city. Literature, theatre, art thrived. Economy commercialized. Rice became currency. Market networks developed. This was sophisticated society, just isolated from European contact. By choice, not backwardness. Americas developed along different paths. Spanish colonies had rigid social structure. Peninsulares born in Spain held top positions. Creoles, Spanish ancestry but American birth, resented exclusion from power. Below them, mixed-race castas, complex hierarchy, African, indigenous, European ancestry. Combinations had specific names: mestizo, mulatto, many others. This system maintained Spanish control, but created tensions. Indigenous populations declined. Disease primarily. Also exploitation. Encomienda system. Spanish granted labor rights. Indigenous people forced to work. Mines, plantations, estates. Conditions were brutal. Some clergy protested. Bartolomé de las Casas argued for indigenous rights, but economic interests prevailed. Portuguese Brazil developed similarly, but more focused on coast, sugar plantations, slave labor. Interior remained largely unexplored. Bandeirantes pushed inland. Slavers and prospectors captured indigenous people, searched for gold, eventually found it. Late 17th century. Gold rush transformed Brazil, shifted focus from coast to interior. British and French colonies in North America differed. Less centralized control, more autonomy. Colonists established assemblies, elected representatives, managed local affairs. This created tradition of self-government. Would lead to independence demands. Population was more diverse. English, Scots, Irish, Germans, Dutch. Religious diversity too. Puritans in New England, Anglicans in Virginia, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Catholics in Maryland, Jews in Rhode Island. No single establishment. This led to eventual religious tolerance, not immediately, but precedent was set. Colonists pushed westward, displaced indigenous peoples, acquired land, sometimes through purchase, often through force. Native populations declined. Disease again. Also warfare. Alcohol disrupted societies. European goods created dependencies. Traditional economies collapsed. This wasn't inevitable. Was result of policies. Colonists wanted land. Natives were obstacles, to be removed by whatever means. Some colonists recognized injustice. Roger Williams, William Penn. Attempted fair dealings, but exceptions. Most interaction was exploitative. Seeds of future conflicts were planted. European balance of power remained fluid. Alliances shifted. Wars erupted regularly. Peace was temporary. Between conflicts, not permanent condition. Diplomacy became specialized field. Ambassadors resided at foreign courts, reported continuously, negotiated treaties, intelligence gathering. This professionalized international relations. Treaties became more detailed, specified terms carefully, defined territories precisely, established mechanisms for dispute resolution. This was EMC, urging international law, not yet systematic, but developing. Mercantilism shaped economic policy. States regulated trade, protected domestic industries, tariffs on imports, subsidies for exports. Colonial trade monopolized only mother country's ships. This created smuggling. Regulations were evaded. Black markets flourished. Enforcement was difficult. Vast distances. Limited administrative capacity. Local officials often corrupted. This gap between policy and practice was a constant theme. Financial innovations continued. Banks became more sophisticated. Credit expanded. Government debt instruments, bonds, annuities. This financed wars. Borrowing against future revenues. National debts accumulated. This would become a major issue. As costs of warfare increased, tax systems couldn't keep pace. Borrowing filled gap, but created obligations. Had to be serviced. This constrained future options. Cycle of debt and war became established. Military revolution continued. Standing armies became normal. Professional soldiers. Regular pay. Standardized equipment. Training drills. Discipline improved. Armies could execute complex maneuvers. Linear tactics developed. Infantry in long lines. Coordinated volleys. This required extensive practice. Casualties increased. More efficient killing. Battles became more decisive. Fewer skirmishes. More formal engagements. This made wars more destructive, but also shorter sometimes. Single battle could determine outcome. Naval warfare evolved. Ships of the line, large warships, multiple gun decks, fought in formation, ahead. Each ship followed next. Concentrated firepower. Fleets could number dozens of ships. Battles were massive. Hundreds of guns, thousands of men. Control of seas determined colonial success. Britain would master this. Gradually established naval supremacy. This enabled empire building, protected trade routes, projected power globally. By late 17th century, modern world was emerging. nation-states, global trade, scientific method, constitutional government, religious plurality, all developing simultaneously, interconnected processes, each reinforcing others. Europe was transforming, but so were societies it contacted. Change was global, not just European story, though Europeans increasingly shaped events through power, economic, military, technological. This dominance would peak in 19th century. But foundations were laid now. In 17th century, age of crisis, but also transformation. Old certainties collapsed. New systems emerged. This created opportunity. Also anxiety. People lived through massive changes, didn't always understand them, couldn't predict outcomes. We know how story ends. They didn't. This perspective matters. History wasn't inevitable. Alternatives existed. Choices mattered. Different decisions would have produced different results. Understanding this helps us see contingency. Nothing was predetermined, future was open, as it always is. This perspective of contingency matters most as 17th century closes. Nothing was destined. Paths diverged constantly. Choices created futures, not fate. Human agency mattered, even amid vast forces. Economic transformation, military revolution, scientific advances, individuals still shaped outcomes. Leaders made decisions. Populations responded. Ideas spread, or didn't. Timing was crucial. Same event, different moments, different results. History is complex interplay, structure and agency, forces and choices. Understanding both is essential. By 1700, European state system was recognizable. Nation-states dominated. Sovereignty was principle. Borders were defined more clearly than before. Treaties specified territories. Maps became more accurate. Surveying improved. Mathematical precision. This affected governance. States knew what they ruled, could administer more effectively. Taxation became more systematic. Census taking developed. Governments wanted information about populations, resources, economic activity. This knowledge enabled power. Information was control. Bureaucracies expanded to process data. File systems developed. Record-keeping systematized. Modern administrative state was emerging, not yet fully formed, but clear trajectory. Military establishments were permanent. Armies didn't disband after wars, remained mobilized. This changed international relations. Constant military pressure. Deterrence became strategy. Show strength, avoid actual fighting, but be ready always. This was expensive. Standing armies cost money, even during peace. Barracks, equipment, pay, training. States competed in military preparedness. Arms races weren't new, but became continuous, not episodic. This drove fiscal innovation. Governments needed revenue, regular, predictable. Tax systems reformed. Excise taxes, customs duties, land taxes, multiple revenue streams. Collection methods improved. Tax farming declined. Direct collection increased. More efficient. Less corrupt. Though corruption never disappeared. National debts became normal. Britain pioneered this. Bank of England, founded 1694. Managed government debt. Issued bonds. Created market for public debt. This allowed sustained borrowing. Lower interest rates. Better terms. Britain could borrow more than rivals. This was strategic advantage. Could finance longer wars, outspend enemies. This would prove crucial. In 18th century conflicts, French governments struggled with debt, less efficient systems, higher borrowing costs. This handicapped France. Despite larger population, greater resources, financial systems mattered. Modern warfare required modern finance. Colonial empires were established. Patterns set. Spain controlled vast territories, but declining power. Silver imports created inflation, didn't generate sustained development. Dutch controlled trade networks. East Indies, Spice Islands, commercial empire, very profitable, but small population, limited military power, vulnerable to larger rivals. France had colonies, North America, Caribbean, India, but often lost them to Britain through warfare. Britain was emerging dominant colonial power. North America, Caribbean islands, trading posts, India. This was foundation for future empire, though still developing. Colonial economies varied. Plantation systems, Caribbean, Southern North America, sugar, tobacco, cotton later. These required labor, initially servants, indentured Europeans, but shifted towards slavery. African slaves. Transatlantic slave trade expanded. Millions transported. Conditions were horrific. Middle Passage. Mortality rates terrible. This was crime against humanity, recognized even then by some. Quakers opposed slavery. Early voices, but economic interest prevailed. Profits were enormous. Sugar especially. Demand in Europe insatiable. Sweetness was luxury, became necessity. Tea, coffee, chocolate, all required sugar. This drove plantation expansion and slave trade. Northern colonies' different economy, family farms, mixed agriculture, some commerce, fishing, shipbuilding, lumber. These didn't use slave labor extensively. Some slaves, but not plantation scale. This created different societies. North versus South would have consequences much later. Seeds were planted now. Economic systems shaped social structures. Slavery created racial hierarchies, justified by pseudoscience. Religion twisted to support it. Bible interpreted selectively. This was moral catastrophe. Effects persist today. Understanding this history matters. Recognizing injustice, learning from it. Native populations continued declining. Disease was primary cause. Epidemics swept repeatedly. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Indigenous peoples had no immunity. Mortality rates catastrophic. Entire communities disappeared. This depopulated regions, made colonization easier. Europeans saw this as divine providence, God clearing land for Christians. This interpretation was convenient, avoided guilt. But some recognized tragedy, protested treatment of natives. These voices were minority, drowned out by land hunger. Economic interests, cultural exchange occurred. Despite conflict, Europeans adopted native crops, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco. These transformed European agriculture. Diets, potatoes especially, could feed more people, same land. This enabled population growth. In Europe, ironic, food from Americas supported European expansion. Natives also adopted European goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth, horses. These changed indigenous societies. Horses revolutionized plains cultures, created new ways of life, hunting, warfare. This was cultural transformation. Technology reshaped society, always has. Intellectual developments continued. Enlightenment was beginning, though term comes later. Ideas were forming, reason, progress, individual rights, natural law. These concepts developed through 17th century. Locke was crucial. 2 treatises of government, published 1689, after Glorious Revolution, justified it. Government by consent, natural rights, life, liberty, property. Government protects these. If fails, people can rebel. Revolutionary ideas would inspire future revolutions. American, French. This was political philosophy based on reason, not tradition, not divine right. This was modern thinking. Science continued advancing. Newton's Principia, published 1687. Mathematical principles of natural philosophy explained motion, gravity, celestial mechanics. This was monumental achievement. Universe operated by mathematical laws. discoverable by reason. This was clockwork universe. God was clockmaker, set it running. Then natural laws operated. This was deism, God distant, not intervening constantly. This reduced superstition, explained phenomena naturally, not miracles, not divine judgment. This was secularization, beginning, not complete, but trajectory clear. Scientific societies spread. Royal Society in London, Académie des Sciences in Paris. These institutionalized science, funded research, published findings, corresponded internationally. Science became collaborative, international. This accelerated progress. Ideas spread faster, experiments replicated, results verified or challenged. This was scientific method, becoming standard, observation, hypothesis, testing, verification. This approach would transform world, apply to everything, not just natural philosophy, social questions, politics, economics, everything subject to rational inquiry. Religious landscape had stabilized. Somewhat, wars of religion ended. Mostly, Westphalia established principle. Cuius, regio ius religio. Ruler determines religion, of territory. This ended religious warfare. Mostly, though tensions remained. Catholics versus Protestants. Within Protestantism, different denominations, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Anabaptists, each claimed truth. Others were heretics, but couldn't eliminate rivals. So, coexistence developed, grudging. Tolerance wasn't principle, yet was pragmatic acceptance, couldn't convert everyone by force. So, allow diversity. This was progress. From earlier violence, some advocated tolerance, principled. Locke wrote, Letter Concerning Toleration, argued government shouldn't enforce religious conformity. Religion was personal, between individual and God. State had no role. This was radical. Most disagreed, but idea spread. Slowly, minority religions appreciated it. Catholics in Protestant countries, Protestants in Catholic countries, Jews everywhere. They wanted tolerance, self-interest, but also principle, recognition of conscience. This was emerging. Individual rights, freedom of thought. These liberal ideas, growing, quietly. Printing continued expanding. Books became cheaper, more available. Literacy increased. Slowly. Still minority could read, but growing minority. This mattered. Ideas spread through print. Newspapers appeared. First regular publications. News from abroad. Commercial information. Political commentary. This created public opinion. People discussed events, formed views. This was new. Previously, rulers decided, subjects obeyed. Now, educated public had opinions, expressed them. This would grow into public sphere, civil society. These modern concepts, emerging now. Coffeehouses became important. England especially, places to gather, discuss, read newspapers, exchange information. These were democratic spaces, different classes mixed, merchants, professionals, artisans, even nobles. All equals in coffeehouse, paid penny admission, could stay all day, read papers, debate. This fostered political awareness, civic engagement. Government watched warily. Coffeehouses could breed dissent, but couldn't suppress them. Too popular. This was civil society, developing. Outside state control, women's situation remained limited. But some changes. More education for upper-class women, reading, writing, some mathematics, languages, music, accomplishments. This was limited, not same as men's education, but more than before. Some women participated in intellectual life, salons in France. Women hosted, invited scholars, artists, philosophers, discussions. These salons were influential. Ideas developed there, spread. Women shaped culture, if not politics, directly. Few women published, under own names. Some used pseudonyms, male names, or anonymous. Afrabain was exception. Successful playwright, poet, novelist, first professional woman writer, in English. This was remarkable. She supported herself by writing, not dependent on patron or husband. This was independence, rare for women, but possible. Door was opening. Crack. Would widen later, but start was now. Family structures were changing, slowly. Nuclear family becoming more common. Urban areas especially. Extended families declined as people moved for work, economic opportunities. This changed relationships. More privacy, but less support. Extended family provided help, childcare, elderly care, sickness. Nuclear family was isolated more. This created new challenges, but also autonomy, freedom from family control. Young people chose spouses more often. Romantic love became factor, not just arranged marriages, economic considerations. This was cultural shift, individualism, growing in personal life, not just politics. Childhood was recognized as distinct phase, not just small adults. Children needed education, moral formation. This was developing idea. Locke wrote about education, emphasized reason, not corporal punishment. Child's mind was blank slate, tabula rasa, shaped by experience. Education mattered. This was influential. Approach to children changed, gradually, still harsh by modern standards, but improvement from earlier neglect or brutality. Medicine remained primitive, but improving, slightly. Hospitals existed, often run by religious orders, charity, for poor, wealthy, treated at home. Doctors had limited knowledge, anatomy improving, through dissection, circulation understood, Harvey's work. But treatment was still ineffective. Bleeding, purging. These did more harm. Medicines were folk remedies, mostly useless, some harmful. Surgery was dangerous, no anesthesia, no antiseptics. Infection was common, mortality high. This wouldn't improve until 19th century. But groundwork laid now. Scientific method applied to medicine. Eventually, public health was neglected. Cities were filthy, no sewage systems, waste in streets, water contaminated. This spread disease, periodic epidemics, plague, typhus, cholera, killed thousands. Governments did little, quarantines sometimes, during plague, but no systematic public health. This was future development. Understanding disease transmission, germ theory, sanitation, all later. But problems were evident now. To some, couldn't solve yet, lacked knowledge, resources. Economic thinking developed. Mercantilism was dominant, but questioned by some. Trade wasn't zero-sum. Maybe, mutual benefit possible. This was radical thought, challenged orthodoxy, but made sense. Both parties gained from trade, or wouldn't trade. This logic was compelling. Free trade ideas, emerging, slowly, against state control, monopolies, tariffs. These restricted trade, reduced prosperity. So argued critics. This was classical economics, beginning, Adam Smith later. But ideas forming now. Agriculture was changing, slowly. Enclosure movement, England. Common lands privatized, consolidated. This increased efficiency. Larger farms, better methods, crop rotation, selective breeding, higher yields, but displaced peasants, lost common rights, became laborers, or moved to cities. This was agricultural revolution, preceded industrial revolution, made it possible. Freed labor, for factories, increased food, for urban populations. But social cost, rural communities disrupted, traditional ways destroyed. This was progress, but painful, for many. Proto-industrialization occurred, rural manufacturing, textiles especially. Merchant capitalists provided materials, wool, flax. Rural families spun, wove, at home. Merchants collected finished goods, paid piecework. This was putting out system, cottage industry, not factories yet, but capitalist relations, wage labor, production for market, not subsistence. This was transition toward industrial capitalism. Skills developed, capital accumulated, markets expanded, infrastructure improved, roads, canals, all preparing for industrial revolution next century. Technology improved. Gradually, not revolutionary yet, but incremental advances, better plows, seed drills, threshing machines. These increased agricultural productivity. Mining technology, pumps for drainage, allowed deeper mines, more coal, iron. These fuels, materials, for coming industry, textile machinery, spinning jennies, later, but earlier improvements, looms, spinning wheels, more efficient. This mattered. Small gains, accumulated, created conditions for larger changes. Energy sources were traditional. Wood, water, wind, animal power, human muscle. These limited what could be accomplished. Coal was used, increasingly, but not yet. Steam power, that was future. But transition beginning. Wood scarcity in England, forced innovation. Coal substitute, this would lead to steam engines. 18th century, revolution, in power, changed everything. But foundations now. Transportation was improving, roads better maintained. Some turnpikes, toll roads, private investment. This improved commerce. Travel times decreased, coaching services, regular schedules. This connected regions, created national markets. Canals were built, transported bulk goods, coal, grain, building materials, cheaply. This was crucial. For industrial development, heavy goods needed water transport until railroads. Much later, communication improved, postal services, regular, reliable, private letters, business correspondence. This enabled commerce, coordination, over distance. Information traveled faster, prices, in different markets, known quickly. This created efficiency. Arbitrage opportunities reduced, markets integrated, national, even international. Price differences between regions narrowed. This was market development, foundation for capitalism. The patterns were set, trajectories established. Modern world was emerging from medieval foundations through early modern transformations. Europe had changed. Fundamentally, so had world. Through European contact, expansion, exploitation. This wasn't inevitable. Different choices existed, alternative paths. But this is what happened. Understanding it matters, recognizing contingency, human agency, historical forces, all interacted, created our world, imperfect, unjust often, but ours, to understand, to learn from, to improve. History teaches. If we listen, not simple lessons, complex truths about power, change, human nature, these endure across centuries, still relevant, today, always.